Good afternoon, and thanks for tuning in to the 2022 Neighbors and Newsrooms Summit, presented by WHYY and N.I.C.E, the News and Information Community Exchange. My name is Christopher Flood the Drummer Norris, and I serve as WHYY's Managing Editor for Community and Engagement. But today I serve as your host and moderator for an afternoon of thoughtful, imaginative, and forward-looking conversations on journalism, collaboration, and community. This summit is all about fostering relationships between residents and reporters and pursuing the future of journalism as a collective. But before we go any further, allow me to introduce you to Sandra Clark, WHYY's VP of News and Civic Dialogue, for opening remarks. Sandra?
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of WHYY to the Neighbors and Newsrooms Summit. Thank you for joining us today. This summit is part of WHYY's commitment to deepen understanding and trust between journalists and content creators and our communities, with the hope of forging relationships and partnerships that lead to a better informed public and better informed newsrooms. In short, walking side by side to fortify us all. At WHYY, these engagements are key to us examining our own perceptions and embedding better practices to serve the public. As my colleague Chris Norris says, it's work where people are prioritized over platforms. I look forward to joining you at the end of the program for a panel with grassroots partners from our News and Information Community Exchange, also known as N.I.C.E. We hope you enjoy the summit and look forward to more conversation with you. So without further delay, Chris, it's back to you.
Thank you, Sandra. Every day in our region, like-minded people are coming together to create and sustain platforms from which to tell meaningful stories and build communities. The state of collaboration in Philadelphia as well, and right now, you get a peek at a few of those collaborative projects. WHYY's community outreach organizer, Eric Marsh, has this segment. Eric?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Chris. My name is Eric Marsh, Sr., and I'm the community outreach organizer for WHYY. And I'm bringing you today a group of collaborations that have occurred over the past year. Collaborations that we feel are really exciting and you could learn a lot more. So the first collaborators that I want to bring up are Emma Restrepo of Dos Puntos Radio and Elizabeth Estrada from WHYY. Ladies.
Hey, Eric, nice to be here.
It's great to be here. Emma, tell us a little bit about your collaboration.
Well, this collaboration was with between me as a journalist from the community, independent journalist, and with WHYY Plan Philly, and it was about series of articles taking as an example, taking as an as a line in the city, Route 47 from Zepeda. And I think that the big media fall into stereotypes with some frequency when they report on the Latino community. So they usually move between victimization and criminality. And this project, in my opinion, is kind of urban journalism that overcomes those two views, show us what stories are between these two extremes, and we know that both extremes are very negative.
Thank you, thank you. So Elizabeth, tell me about your experience with working with Emma and what made this collaboration valuable.
Yeah, I mean, so many things. It was great working with Emma and the other journalists that we partnered with, Jane Von Bergen, because, I myself am a Latina at WHYY in our newsroom. And I also see not only the negative coverage that exists like in our media landscape, but also the lack of it. And so being able to create a project, WHYY's first ever bilingual project, that really focused on the community and talked about the things that we all see and experience, right? The joy, the successes, the victories, the family, the values that we have, and being able to do stories that focus on that. It was just so beautiful to be able to have that reflection in our work. And also to be able to build new relationships with not only, the people in our audience that we weren't necessarily reaching, but also with different organizations and people across Philadelphia who are really shaping their neighborhoods and their communities in a really positive way. And something else that was really valuable was being able to do this project in English and Spanish, and then offer that kind of special, unique bilingual version. So whoever was coming onto the project's page would be able to read it in whatever language they spoken or read, and be able to encounter and experience something new.
Thank you. Emma, what were some of the learnings that you received from participating in this? What did you learn, and what do you feel like you got out of this process?
I think for the community itself, it was very huge to probably for the first time to see their voices, to hear their voices in a media like WHYY and their stories. So more than for me, I think for me as a journalist, it was great to see the joy of the community for the first time being covered in a more, with more justice. And for me, it was fantastic to work with a media as WHYY because since I came to this country, I used to listening to WHYY. I didn't understand a word at that time. so being able to connect as a journalist to see how the media works, how to share different opinions, point of views, angles. It was incredible, richful for two parts, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Elizabeth, you talked about some of the partners and other organizations when you answered last. Tell me a little bit about those relationships that were built during this collaboration. What did you get out of those?
Yeah, I will say it was challenging. I think that WHYY is such a respected and important outlet, in Philadelphia and in the region. And so I think it was really valuable to be able to collaborate with some of these partners, right? I think obviously Emma and Jane, as they were our primary reporters and collaborators, but also thinking about kind of smaller scale media, which I think a lot of the N.I.C.E members represent. So thinking about Latinos Radio, right? WPPM, which is public access radio station here in Philadelphia, and some of those smaller scale outlets that are really engaging directly and sometimes, created by people in the community. And so I think for me, it was a little bit of a hurdle kind of trying to build those relationships from scratch in many instances, because WHYY hadn't really engaged with them before this project or engaged with them in like a deeper, more meaningful way. But it was really, I think, rewarding and important. And I think it just goes to say that like people are out there, these organizations are out there, people are out there doing their work. And we as an outlet, can't just go in and expect to be the experts when this is the work and the lives that people are leading each and every single day. And so coming in with that open spirit, that collaborative spirit of being like, I want to learn from you as much as hopefully I can kind of help you, and having that kind of like mutual spirit was super important.
Awesome.
And I think it was, it had its hard moments, its difficult moments trying to kind of, I think, work through some of the, history or lack of history there, but overall it was super important. And those are relationships that I still cherish and foster to today.
Excellent. Well, Elizabeth and Emma, thank you so much for your work on the Route 47 Historias along a bus route. For folks who are interested in finding out more, you can visit whyy.org. So thank you. We want to move on to our next set of collaborators. And our next set of collaborators are Jinich and Max Strickberger of Generation Pandemic. Alan and Max, how are you guys doing today?
Eric, good. Thanks so much for having us.
No, thank you. Thank you. So tell the folks who are watching a little bit about Generation Pandemic and what brought it about.
Generation Pandemic is an oral history project that focuses on the experiences of young people all across America. And it came about because Alan and I are roommates at school together, and we spent last fall sitting together in our apartment thinking about how we didn't really know what was happening with other folks who were our age. And we became really interested in what the experiences were like for young people and felt like there wasn't as much attention on that demographic. So in the spring, we unenrolled from school and basically worked with a professor and some journalists who we had studied and reached out to and thought their work was amazing, and basically road tripped all around the country through 23 states, interviewing 18 to 25-year-olds about their past year during the pandemic, conducting oral histories.
Why was it important for you to do this? What did you feel like was missing from media conversations that forced you to go out and create this storytelling process?
I'd say at that time, we felt like there was a lot of attention on older folks during the pandemic for really significant and important reasons. And at the same time, we were really interested in what was going on for other folks at this age of 18 to 25 that can be really precarious just generally in our lives. And we knew from the experience with our friends and people we were in touch with how the pandemic exacerbated that, and felt like we wanted to shine a greater spotlight on what was going on for those folks.
Tell me something, what was the reception like, or what did you learn while you were traveling across these states and talking to these young people about the pandemic? What's something that stands out for you as a learning?
And there was so much we learned. I think, one of the biggest things is we just learned how to, build trust with people, with complete strangers, like before, me especially, I was pretty timid when it came to, going up to strangers, but Max pushed me, and we, by the end of the trip, we could go, walk up to anyone on the street and just build a relationship, start a conversation, that got pretty deep pretty quick. And I think it's kind of a really useful way of engaging with people that now I do with all my friends. So it kind of gave me a new way of building conversation.
Yeah, and I'd add that, about young people specifically, we found that first of all, a lot of the experiences were super varied, but what we did see was people were at such a precarious time, and that the pandemic really accelerated whatever experiences they were having. So if they were moving towards more of a state of independence, sometimes the pandemic accelerated that, and we saw some young people pick up and move to jobs from Virginia to New Orleans. I'm thinking of Shay, who's on our website, and you can read about her story, or people like Sharon, who's also on our site that you can read, who was shifting towards independence, but the pandemic put her back in her home environment that really wasn't a comfortable space for her to be in. And it took away a lot of the independence that young adulthood was supposed to bring had it not been for the pandemic.
Well, as we get ready to wrap up, tell folks how we can find out more information about Generation Pandemic and the podcast that you guys are working on.
Yeah, please check out our website. It's called generationpandemicproject.com. You can also check out our Instagram page, which is generationpandemic_. And yes, you can see our stories there. We have about 10 up. We just published a new one. We just published a new podcast on Emily, who's a pharmacy tech in Wyoming. And also, please feel free to reach out if you're interested in collaborating. Anyone who's listening, or if you have a story that you want to tell us, please reach out. We have our emails up on the site.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Alan and Max. Thank you so much. For more information on Generation Pandemic, you can visit WHYY.org. As we move to our next collaborators, I want to introduce Duncan and Mara Zepeda of the Philadelphia Media Founders Exchange. Welcome, Josh and Mara. How are you doing?
Doing great, Eric. Thank you so much for having us today.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys for being here. Tell us a little bit more about the Philadelphia Media Founders Exchange. Excuse me.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Josh.
Oh, go for it.
The Philadelphia Media Founders Exchange was co-designed by the Knight Lenfest Local News Transformation Fund, the Lenfest Institute, Zebras Unite, which is what I represent, and over 30 Philadelphia-based journalists and media makers and entrepreneurs. And really, the exchange aims to do a couple of things. First, we want to assess the news and information needs of Philadelphia, and then empower communities to tell their own stories by supporting BIPOC-owned and operated media organizations. And we also want to support the diversification of those information systems, and then identify and support innovative and sustainable revenue models for new novel structures and ways of working together. So it's all about supporting Philadelphia's incredible ecosystem of media entrepreneurs, many of which are here today.
Excellent. Before we go to Joss, Mara, I want to ask you another question. What was it about Philadelphia that attracted the attention of Zebras Unite in this collaborative?
Gosh, well, I mean, first I should say that I started my career at WHYY as a reporter back about 10 years ago. So I have strong roots to the community and really love what's going on there. I think the ecosystem is so vibrant, so incredibly vibrant. We're also seeing that the city, you know, to its name of brotherly love and sisterly affection, it has inclinations to be more collaborative and cooperative and sees business enterprises in that light. So we're not looking for, you know, unicorn hockey stick growth at all costs companies. We really see a spirit of collaboration, cooperation, and mutualism. And third, one of our founding members of Zebras Unite Black and Brown Founders has deep roots in Philadelphia, having hosted Project North Star there for a number of years. And so as a key collaborator in the development of this curriculum, we just had a deep Philly network. And finally, we have done a lot of capital innovation work with the Inclusive Capital Collective, and Philadelphia is one of those cities as well. So we just saw the energy of Philadelphia, the spirit, the vibrancy is such an incredible opportunity to learn more.
Well, speaking of energy and spirit, Joss, what was it that attracted you to this collaborative? And tell us a little bit about your role.
So I'm serving as the community catalyst for the Founders Exchange, and it was an exciting opportunity to really take my experience as a Philadelphia-based media entrepreneur and to engage my fellow community members with recruiting people for the co-design process, with speaking to people about their needs, and with really having a mindset of service to make sure that that I was using my both personal relationships and also just my understanding of some of the needs and the history of what was happening in the ecosystem to bring that to the project and to help to connect some dots.
Excellent. So what was some of the things that you noticed in Philadelphia? So Mara talked about the energy, the vibrancy of brotherly love, but as a local entrepreneur here, what are some of the issues that you feel like that this collaborative can support and can uplift?
Well, one of the things I noticed was the level of grit among our entrepreneurs in Philadelphia. I mean, people would just make things happen. Sometimes it seemed as if it was out of thin air. Once there was a project, people were committed to their communities. They were committed to creating media, committed to developing outlets and making connections. So people had audiences, they had relationships, but they may not have ever had a certain kind of support. So it's been very exciting to hear about the interesting and innovative ways that people have started their endeavors, and to even suggest that there was funding available to support folks, I think excited people in a very new way. And so we had some interesting design elements in this process, which included not only working with the media makers to co-design the process, but also creating very open spaces for people to ask questions through information sections where they could ask anything. And in those sessions, people shared information about what they started, the communities they were serving, and their hopes. And it was just incredibly inspiring to have people who may have felt shut out of more traditional opportunities feel invited to speak and to share and to apply for this one.
Thank you. So as we get ready to wrap up, Mara, tell us where you are in this process and how can folks find out a little bit more about the Philadelphia Media Founders Exchange?
Yeah, we've just closed the application process. So we were accepting applications through January 18th, and we are now in the process of reviewing them, which is so exciting. We received dozens and dozens of applications from people that really, many of whom had never applied for funding like this or never put themselves out there for the opportunity. In terms of where you can learn more, I would recommend just Googling the Philadelphia Media Founders Exchange, which you'll find on the Lenfest Institute, which gives you more information, including an FAQ and more about the initiative itself. So we will be launching the cohort likely in early March. And if you would like to learn more, potentially be a facilitator, a workshop leader, a coach, interface in some way, please reach out to entrepreneurship@lenfestinstitute.org. And we would love to hear from you and be in relationship and community.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you. And again, I look forward to finding out more as this cohort develops. Our next collaborators are Steve Fillmore and Carolyn Sullivan of The Local. The Local are also partners in NICE, the News and Information Community Exchange. So Steve and Carolyn, welcome.
Oh,
Hi.
thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Eric.
Yes. Glad to have you here and glad to see you again in this format. So tell us some of the exciting things. You guys have a unique situation because you've been partners, you're a print newspaper, which is also rare, but you're also part of the News and Information Community Exchange in which you're interacting with a lot of other partners in the exchange and collaborating on content. Tell us a little bit about your experience when it comes to collaborating and what does it mean to you?
Well, it's been actually a revelation for us. We have been covering East Falls, Germantown, sort of the northwest section of the city for some time. NICE allowed us to expand our horizons, so to speak. And we've met all sorts of people, including Emma, Tamara Russell, AKA POC, Purple Sage Blackwell, and it's given us sort of insights from around the city and actually given us some real insights into sort of the commonality of a lot of the issues that apply across the city, not just the neighborhoods.
Excellent. Carolyn, tell us a little bit about why do you feel like collaborations are so important for media and news ecosystems today?
Well, I don't think any one of us can be everywhere. And I think a lot of the local news, the ones that were historically there, the neighborhood news tellers, the community news tellers, they've all been either put out of business or absorbed. So there's not a whole lot of that, but people are still talking. So it's important to go straight to the source and give the sources a platform, I think is a new kind of way that you can tell things authentically without actually having to, live in that community 24/7 and invest all that time talking to everybody there. It's impossible to do it, right? So it's an efficient way to do it. And I think it makes it more colorful and fun.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we don't have a lot more time, but I want to just get one more answer from you guys, just in terms of why is it that, what is it about collaborations that the community can learn, the larger entrepreneurial system should learn? What are some things that you've learned in participating with NICE and your other partners?
Well, as I mentioned earlier in the beginning, that there is a commonality of issues: gentrification, development, even down to things like speed bumps and walkability. All of these things apply. It's just a question of how there's a slightly different tweaks to them from various parts of the city. But I think there is, when we can see that common issue, we can see those commonalities. I think that's something that actually makes it a whole lot easier.
And I feel that we're serving a need between like the mainstream media and then that social media where everyone's sort of so we're like in between. And I think there's a room for that, and that depends on collaboration to do
Understood. All right, well, Steve and Carolyn, thank you so much. For more information where you can find out more about the local, NICE, and their other partners, go to whyy.org/NICE. And to all of my guests here, thank you so much for the information that you shared, the work that you're doing. And I can't wait to talk to you more in depth about the work that's happening in each of your institutions. So, and now we're going to pass it back to Chris. Chris?
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all the collaborators. That was a really inspiring segment. I hope our audience also found it inspiring. We're going to take a quick station identification break and be back with our first panel. You're watching the Neighbors and Newsrooms Summit, fostering collaboration between residents and reporters. This event is presented by WHYY and NICE, the News and Information Community Exchange. NICE is made possible by a generous grant from the Nightland Local News Transformation Fund. Good afternoon again and welcome back. I'm Christopher Flood, the drummer Norris, WHYY's managing editor for community and engagement. Philadelphia is experiencing a gun violence crisis. In 2022, the city marked its deadliest year on record. So how did the media do in covering the problem? Did the media report what matters? And what exactly is the role of the news in promoting public safety? We'll talk about that now with the first panel of the afternoon. This is Reporting What Matters, Gun Violence. Allow me to introduce our panelists. Jim MacMillan is the director of the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting. Sabrina Iglesias is the community outreach editor of The Trace. Pastor Carl Day is an activist and pastor of Culture Changing Christians Church. A. Benjamin Mans is a media contributor for Broad and Liberty and Philly Weekly, as well as a former law enforcement officer. And Erica Atwood is the senior director of the Office of Criminal Justice and Public Safety for the City of Philadelphia. Good afternoon to you all.
Afternoon.
Let's go back and revisit 2020. Philly ended the year with a staggering 562 homicides. How would each of you grade and describe the local media's coverage of these horrific 12 months? We'll do 60 seconds for the first round, starting at the top with Jim.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to begin with saying that I don't feel especially qualified to grade all of my peers, but the work that we do at the Center for Gun Violence Reporting is representing the views that we gather from the community and raising those voices. Based on what we're learning, well, in any case, I don't think it's fair to give the whole class the same grade. I think it's safe to say there are people earning A's for the few journalists and newsrooms that are focused on survivors, raising community voices, elevating evidence-based solutions, and perhaps F's for most of the incident reporting with too much fear-mongering and dehumanizing and stigmatizing victims, and probably a lot of work that happens in between.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that. Sabrina.
I'm on the same wavelength as Jim, as usual. I tend to reject a typical grading scale just because my hope is that this field will continue to grow and learn from the ideas that get brought up in spaces like these. I think if we're talking about, the broadcast news, which so many Philadelphians do rely on, I think it was great to see 6 ABC and WHYY teaming up. And same with Fox 29 doing a lot with Save Our Streets, which has been a great example of community-focused journalism on the topic of gun violence. But at the same time, I don't see these stations doing gun violence stories and then recommending resources to the communities live on the air. So I don't think I'll give a specific grade, but I will say that if we're talking about the big news stations, there's a lot of room for growth.
Thank you for that. Very nuanced answer so far. I appreciate that. Pastor Carl Day.
Man, yeah, Jim nailed it in so many ways. I think that I wouldn't really give a passing grade overall if I have to do it, and combine everybody. Reasons being is, as my sister just said, that oftentimes the resources aren't really highlighted or focused on. I think that far too much of the reporting has been centered around people's political agendas, ways to throw jabs at politicians and particular ones that they may agree with or don't agree with. And which leads to people talking about more on the surface issues, which really drives the agenda of the people and take people away from the real underlying issues of what's really causing violence in our city. So depending on which news channel or which reporter you listen to or watch, and depending on what agenda they may have with a particular politicians or particular administrations, they'll be keeping those things on surface, still tackling antiquated issues or on the surface issues and not really getting to the root causes of what's really driving the youth doing what they're doing. And I think that a lot of times we miss the mark when that's really driving the messages and not really talking about, a lot of the work and highlighting that work. And typically when the work is highlighted, especially amongst mainstream news sources, they get 30 to 60 seconds, as opposed to the fear mongering that's taking place that Jim was speaking about. So yeah, that's where I stand. And, hope that was a sufficient answer.
Oh, no, absolutely. Speaking of 60 seconds, you guys are doing a wonderful job staying on time. A. Benjamin Mans, how about you?
First, just call me Ben. We'll make things very easy.
Thank you.
Well, I couldn't agree with Pastor Carl and Sabrina any further. This is a more nuanced question. The mainstream media gets an F. I'll say it right now because the truth of the fact is we're not going past the soundbite. And we're way too quick to label people. whether it be based on a political objective or a social goal. And the truth is, people are dying at exponential rates in our street, and we're not looking at the nuanced answer of the chicken and the egg. And the truth is, media as we know it has never adapted to online. So the old muckrackers that used to catch crime stories like Jimmy Breslin in New York or Paul Avery in San Francisco or Charlie LaDuff, who's still doing it in Detroit, don't exist in places like Philly because all the papers have merged and all the media has conglomerated in one sort. And I know there's outliers like Steve Keeley at Fox 29, but the truth is, unless you're reading think tank journalism like Broad and Liberty or a paper that traditionally doesn't care if they're in the in crowd, you have a problem getting to the chicken and the egg, i.e., why are we at a point where 562 people are murdered? Not just looking at the crime scene, and here's what happened last night, but what contributors led to it and how we could actually address it in the way that has been done in the past.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate your commentary about media consolidation, how that's impacted reporters' ability to really do investigative work. Thank you so much. Director Atwood, same question for you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation today. And I'm just going to kind of build upon everything that other folks said. And I'm a child of an educator, and so my grade would kind of be a C. Okay. In C in terms of they do a good job of telling us what's wrong, but we don't get to unpacking the root causes of gun violence, and gun violence honestly being a symptom of other systemic issues that our communities are experiencing, and how we get to those root causes and get to truly solutions. We don't hear a shifting of the narrative. To the earlier point about fear mongering, there's a real centering on who to be afraid of, and not really giving us an opportunity to have hope, and what that looks like in terms of what narrative is a local media creating, and what are they doing around stereotypes and doubling down on a racial divide in how we report on gun violence. I would love to see more stories of hope, stories of folks that are doing good work in the community, in addition to and in juxtapositioned against what are the issues we're facing, and what are the problems, and how we can be safe in our communities.
Thank you for that, Director Atwood. I appreciate that commentary as well, because it is true that while these communities, many of them disadvantaged and marginalized, and are suffering with extreme levels of crime, there's a lot of great things that are happening in there. There are a lot of people who still have joy and still have hope, and those stories are worth telling. Director, I'd like to stay with you for a moment and then go to Jim. And Ben, I have a question directly for you. You know, Director, as someone who's not a journalist, looking from the outside looking in, do you think that if newsrooms collaborated more with community members, that we could get to that point of stories that really humanize their subjects? And if so, what would that collaboration look like?
I think the collaboration looks like spending time, not just covering, but learning. I think the conversation should be had about what do we want to see? How do we want to be portrayed as community in our media outlets? What are the gaps of knowledge that we have that we need information to get to? I'm in community a lot. Folks, while I hold a high level position, I truly believe in, I can't do my job effectively unless I am working intangibly with community members. And what I hear is they don't know about a lot of the programs and opportunities that are being done, not just by the city, but by other organizations. I would love for the media to not only be a point of accountability for us in positions of power, but also as an amplifier and a microphone for opportunities for folks to connect into solutions, and in a way to amplify what is really happening in communities versus the the narratives that exist around despair and around a lack of hope and a lack of access. I think that we do have an access issues for some resources and opportunities, but we also have an adoption issue. And it's really that connecting to what you need to what exists. And I think the media can serve a really good role in making those through lines and those connections and the amplification of opportunities, be it jobs, be it programs, be it grants, all the things that exist that our communities really need to expand and deepen the impact of the good work that's already happening.
Thank you. Same question to you, Jim. What do you think that collaborating with newsrooms and communities could help tell these stories better, and more particularly with an emphasis on humanization?
Yeah, thanks. One of the questions that I was prepared for is what we've learned. And, we've learned from our Credible Messenger reporting project, where we bring people from the community and pair them with advanced professional journalists, that the idea, so just for background, the idea in this project is that people from the community are actually doing the reporting, people with lived experience interviewing other people with lived experience or other sorts of experts. But what we're hearing is that people being interviewed, people who've been harmed, people who've been shot and recovered, people who've lost a loved one, feel that when they're interviewed by somebody else who has been through the experience, that it's easier to be more forthcoming, that they can trust them more, that there's more mutual understanding, and that sort of reporting gets to the truth. I think there's lots of ways that organizations can collaborate. We're trying to create them, but I should say something. I also wanted to say, you caught me off guard with that first question by coming to me first. I really wanted to start by saying how grateful I am to be here, but especially how grateful I am for your attention to this topic. This is an excellent example of how it's done, and it's hard to improve on that.
I appreciate that. Ben, I have a particular question about your reporting, but I want to give you 30 seconds as somebody who's in the newsroom, both operating with Broad and Liberty, but also when you work with Philly Weekly. Is it easy to collaborate with community residents? And if it's not, what are the challenges that some people face in the newsroom?
The challenge basically now is the pool of people going out for this job. So I am not a born and bred journalist. I joined this basically as a way to get a voice out that was not being properly balanced. So I joined the newsroom out of frustration to tell a story. But I also come from the shared experience of a person who walked a beat in the mid-90s in New York and then walked a beat in Southeast DC in the late 90s. So, the old school journalism who had a flip top pad and went out, people who are still doing it in some cities, has been replaced by millennials who use these. And I am not saying that to just sound like an old man who's telling everyone to get off their lawn, but the editorial has been robbed. Because when the editors aren't forcing their journalists to go out and knock on a door, what happens is the journalists pick up the phone, get a denial, hang up the phone, and then become a scribe for the PIO in whatever department wants to spin a story. And that's not how this job gets done. You need to get out there, you need to get in that community, and you need to be not afraid to talk to people of all walks of life. And I don't know if that's my shared experience talking as someone who did that for a living for the majority of his life. But sources come to you, confidential or not, because they trust you to sit face to face and have a cup of coffee with them. Yeah. Until you force that newsroom out there, it's not going to happen anymore.
I appreciate that. I'm going to come to Pastor Carl and Sabrina in a second, and then we'll have a much larger conversation. But I wanted to stick with you, Ben, about a particular story you told in October of 2021. You talk about your sources. You wrote a piece for Philly Weekly where you talk to senior police sources about what's called special assignment investigations, also known as S-jobs.
S-jobs.
Your sources allege that this classification may be a tool used by the commissioner and others to lower the already shocking homicide rate. And I'm curious, why was this story important to tell? Do you think it informed the conversation that we're having? And was this an example of what you consider accountability journalism?
Yeah, and the story, and if I go too long, stop me, Chris, but the story here goes way back if you know your history. And this is something as a former law enforcement officer that I could tell, because in the late 90s, when Charles Ramsey came to DC, when I was in DC, they started doing something called stat fixing, because all the the police departments in the country were trying to catch up with New York, who invented the CompStat system of holding police commanders accountable for the numbers of crimes, the trends of crimes in their communities. The problem is they're trying to duplicate a 40,000 member police department's strategies. In a department in DC, we had 3,500 at the time. Here they have a little over 6,000 now, they're short. You have a situation where you're not able to simply deploy resources the way New York does. So what do? They do something called stat fixing. And, you know, we've gotten denials from the police department, but I've had people at the inspector and above level come to us confidentially to tell us, listen, the S jobs, they've always existed, but the S jobs were there before, and every city has something similar for things like overdoses, for things where, you know, scientific and DNA results are pending, for things like justifiable homicides, like self-defense shootings, police officer involved shootings, things like that. We had more S jobs in the last 2 years than in recent memorable history in Philadelphia. Why? And if you look at some of the crimes in the last year, the 2020 reporting, where they kept it suspiciously at 499, at least 2 of the murders were shootings that happened before New Year's, and the person died on life support after New Year's, where every year prior, the police department reported, hey, that number would have went back on 2020.
Give you 30
but
seconds.
It went
Ben.
toward 2021. So yeah, they want to keep the stats down, and it's not just that. When domestic violence calls end up domestic incidents because, of course, the husband or the assailant left before the police got there, and they don't follow up with the report, that's one. When a stolen license plate becomes a lost tag, as if the bolts magically unloosen themselves, that becomes a stat in and of itself. So this is a wild thing that keeps the stats down, and it is not playing the game kosher.
I appreciate it. Did anyone want to respond to anything they heard before I move on? If not, Sabrina, I have a question for you, and then Carl and Director Atwood, I'm coming to you next. Sabrina, your work with the Trace, a platform that investigates gun violence in America, also includes Up the Block, a resource hub for Philadelphians affected by gun violence. Have you been able to identify any information gaps in your work? And if so, how can your learning inform the reporting done by the Trace, by WHYY, and by Ben?
Yeah, I definitely have been able to identify information gaps. You know, that's what Up the Block is all about. And that's really the main thing Newsroom should all be aiming to do, of course. All it really took was just listening to my community, going out. I did what I called a listening tour because I started this project during, you know, COVID before we had vaccines. So nothing was super safe to be able to go out into the public. But I did that listening tour before even beginning to start this project. So for several months, I went to virtual town hall meetings. I listened to Germantown Radio's Info Hub, where they create a really great space for Philadelphians to voice their concerns. I stayed on top of social media, talked to people over the phone. Sometimes I just go out and talk to people at the local basketball court, nearby parks. And the project is still growing, and I'm continuing to listen into this day just to make sure that we aren't missing out on those information gaps that we should be responding to. So keeping your finger on the pulse of questions people actually have is super important for both my workplace and other newsrooms, because we should never just assume we know what people want to hear and we know what questions people have. I think it's becoming really, really clear that every newsroom needs to have at least one engagement reporter. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to, you know, make sure we're filling those information gaps. I've been with the Trace for 1.5 years now, and the work I'm doing with the community has definitely shown them that this type of reporting is huge when it comes to understanding what type of stories should be written in the first place and how we can get that information out to the community.
I appreciate it. Thank you. We have about 12 minutes left in this segment, and so I want to bring us all together for a conversation. But I do appreciate what you said, Sabrina, because I think the through line of everything I'm hearing from everybody, whether it's Ben talking about going out and knocking on doors, or if it's Director Atwood talking about how to understand what the communities are wanting, it's all about listening, right? And it doesn't seem to be that complicated. Listening seems to be a big part of that. To that point, Pastor Carl Day, people like you, people like John Solomon, Dante Moore, you guys go out into very hard to reach neighborhoods quite often. And you talk to young people who our newsrooms and others would consider hard to reach. But I also hear from my colleagues that it's that particular demographic that is missing in the coverage that we need to hear from. Do you think it is important to hear from Black men and boys who are either involved in gun violence or at risk? And the second part of that question is, how would you recommend news professionals go about building that relationship? And that's a question I'm going to ask to each one, but I want to start with you, Pastor.
Man, great question, Chris. And much like my fellow comrades here, I appreciate this opportunity. It's essential, it's mandatory. To much like many try to hold politicians and elected officials accountable to involving the youth in these conversations, the very same burden should be on, media publications alike to still speak to the very same people that they'll cover. And to that point, so essential, even with trying to collaborate or build relationships with them, you have to show a level of investment. The same way that we ask anybody else that hold any type of position to be on the grounds, to build relationships, to show a level of care and concern, you have to do that while these people are still alive. Oftentimes the media is trying to represent or speak for what's going on, but really only covering these issues on the surface. And I mean, not for nothing, I'll say it and I'll be fair about it, because for one end, a young Black male in this city would feel like, media don't really care. And the reason why is because of a few reasons. I mean, you have Philly Weekly, who did a guess the homicide rate in regards to how many people are dying, as if they're just disposable and they're just a number. Then you see other television stations that report another homicide and they just report the number. Not many people follow up. Not many people are invested to really care and talk to them any other day if it's not centered around death. And it's like, what are we doing to truly follow up and ensure that these people are getting the proper resources or that the proper care is there? So if a person don't really believe that you care and they're just represented as a number, and this is just something that's polarizing and for us to discuss at the moment so that we can really politicize this argument about death, then guess what? Nobody wants to talk to you in the streets. So like you said, the people that you named that are surrounded around me that hit the communities and pound the pavement, the reason why they're willing to talk to me, the reason why they're willing to allow me into their lives or even be able to infiltrate some of these beefs and some of these issues is because we're constantly there. And it has to be a level of consistency. It has to be a level of investment. And you can't be doing things for shock value or just a press conference that's standing on the corner while the blood is still spilled there. And because there's politicians there, like who's following up with the families, who's really talking to these brothers, finding out the root causes of the violence, finding out what they truly need instead of just trying to make assumptions and still using the same verbiage that's been used for the last 30 years in Philadelphia since we've been at 300 plus homicides every single year for the last 3 decades. So I'm shutting up, but that's kind of my answer of how we can, but also we got to be fair.
I appreciate that. Ben, I'm coming to you in a second. Director Atwood, same question for you. Is there a value in hearing from these young Black men and boys who are on the ground? And if so, how do reporters build those relationships?
Yeah, I think that when we think about victimization, we think about victims of violence, we very rarely see somebody who looks like her. We very rarely see who is the predominant gun violence survivor in Philadelphia. We very rarely see stories on those who are young, who are Black, who are living with a disability now because of an injury, the humanization of these young Black and brown men who have had this traumatic experience and what is then the rest of their life look like. When we talk about gun violence from a political standpoint, locally and nationally, when it's covered, we love to cover the victims that people can hug. We love to cover the victims that people feel safe about, feel safe standing next to. There is this projection of smaller children, and we jump to, and not that we shouldn't, and not that our children need our protection, but our children are also 23-year-old Black men and 23-year-old Latino men. And so what are we doing to balance the narrative in the face of the victim, to humanize them in our media, especially for those who are unfamiliar with the issue, for those who are want to be supportive of us getting to safe and healthy communities. But I also think that if we can connect with those who have been directly impacted by violence, that maybe we can build a pipeline for diversity even stronger in the field of media, in the field of coverage. What are we doing to potentially say, hey, look, you might be a great writer too, even though you've experienced this horrific event. How do we then begin to cultivate you, not to just cover your story, but for also you to be a storyteller? There's an organization by the name of Lion Story, and it's based off a parable. What happens if the story is told by the lion and not the hunter? And what do we do if we give lions a microphone and we allow them to tell their story? And how can we do that? We do that with building authentic relationships and diversifying newsrooms.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Ben, you've been making some faces. I imagine that you disagree with at least some of what Pastor and Director Atwood have said. Go ahead.
I definitely agree with Pastor Carl. You know, the key is to be out in the community. But, you know, we're not looking at, and I'm going to go back to my chicken and the egg reference, is the policies that have contributed to this and the gross corruption in the things we are not covering in the newsroom because we're too focused on gun violence. I wrote another piece in the weekly called Call a Murderer Murder. You could catch it on phillyweekly.com. And the true fact is, if we keep looking at the tool used and not looking at the other contributing factors or the complete weakness that some of our political leaders, our elected leaders, and our key appointed leaders in the city have had in utilizing the nation's fourth largest law enforcement agency and prosecuting effectively to give community groups like Carl's some breathing room so that they could go out and do their work for the next generation and save a community so that it isn't rampantly happening on the street. Well, guess what? We could get some things done. And that's the problem. We are completely ignoring some of the endemic issues that generationally have happened in government that have led to these things. And I'm not giving people a pass because, well, they want to take the touchy-feely approach. There's a room for that. There's agencies for that. There are groups for that. Meanwhile, we got to stop blaming the reactive forces for simply doing their job. And we have to take a huge shining light. That's our responsibility as the fourth estate, to put a huge shining light on things that don't work so that people don't keep dying to make a point of a failed protocol. And whether it's some of the policing strategies that go back 50, 60 years, or some of the prosecutorial strategies that only go back 4 years in this city, things are not working, and it's up to us to fix them, especially when we're dealing with the highest individual tax burden in the United States. We're paying for these failures. So why aren't our media reporting this effectively? So that's my problem. Simply calling it gun violence and not getting into the fact that some of the Texas, Florida, Virginia, places where guns are very common, but gun enforcement is done effectively, doesn't get to the issue of why people are picking up these guns and using them in exponential rates.
Thank you for that, Ben. Sabrina and Gemma, coming to you in a second. I know we're going to lose Director Atwood in a sec, so I wanted to give you a chance to respond if you wanted to.
Yeah, so really quickly, I will say this, and Ben, I don't totally disagree with you, but I also think as a part of the narrative, as we expand the conversation beyond just the issue of gun violence, we have to, I agree, we have to look at the whole system, but we also have to look at a system that doesn't, if we look at our carceral system and we look at our justice system, it doesn't, when we go through prosecution and we go through the enforcement errors, it doesn't kick back out people who are better off. And so we have to do two things at once. We have to be able to walk and chew gum. We have to be able to make our community safe and remove malignancy from our communities in a way that does less harm and allows for people who are vulnerable to be either shot or shooting an opportunity to a different track. We We have to have some accountability in that, but in that accountability, in our carceral system, we also have to not continue to traumatize people. Oftentimes when we put people into the cycle, they're worse off when they come out. We have to also have that conversation. And so how can we, one, make communities safe and also reform our carceral system in a way that is truly just?
Thank you for that. That's a lot been said. Sabrina and Jim, I want to give you guys a chance to respond to everything that you've heard. Sabrina, you first.
Yeah, I do agree that there are obviously issues within the system, but I feel as though we should also be focusing on the community on a community level and getting people who can relate to people within their community, because we are neighbors and we should be looking after each other and wanting to help each other. And like you said, the through line is just getting out and talking to people. And I think that, bringing people together in that way, and I don't know if that will solve gun violence. I don't think that there's one thing that will, but I think we do need to be looking at how we can relate to each other, what the resources are. Accountability, a huge one for me is I never want to go out and re-traumatize somebody just to get their story. And that's a big one. I think we should all be looking inside ourselves and doing some training and making sure that that's not something that we are doing. We should not be making things worse. We should be making them better.
I agree completely, and I appreciate you saying that. Trauma-informed reporting is completely underrated. And I'm proud to say our newsroom will be doing so in the next week or so, undergoing the first of many trainings for that. Jim.
Well, thanks. I'm not especially interested in responding because I feel like this conversation's really gone off the rails and focused almost entirely in the last 10 minutes or so on law enforcement and criminal justice. If you think about gun violence more broadly, it's an incredibly complex, multifaceted topic that we can hardly address in one day anyway. But if you view it as a public health crisis, the first thing we have to understand and embrace is that it's preventable and that there are evidence-based strategies on how to prevent violence. There are policies, there are dollars. We just need to get together and do what we know works. That's my opinion. But more importantly, I think it's a good place to kind of plug in what we've learned about reporting. Our research at the center is focused on identifying the most impactful, ethical, and empathetic reporting possible to help prevent gun violence. But for now, we have a guide based on the Better Gun Violence Reporting Summit. Just before the pandemic, we gathered 250 people, coincidentally at WHYY, to talk about better gun violence reporting. And we talked about, and we developed a guide based on the findings from the speakers, from journalists who cover gun violence locally and nationally, from researchers from across a broad spectrum of disciplines, and from community representatives, all of whom participated. And our takeaways were that to get this done, first of all, and there are some common threads here with things we've heard. Journalists have to learn their place earn their place in the community, to put community narratives first, to recognize, as I said, the complexity of the topic, because complexity makes people more curious. The idea is that you try to make people to think about it rather than telling them what to think. I think it was actually your advice from the stage, Chris, not to try to cover the topic, but to engage communities to tell the story, to spend time going to events, visiting places of worship and support groups, learning as much as you can about a neighborhood and the people who live there. That's how we're going to figure out how to stop this. And then perhaps finally to consider the impact of your reporting. Not all journalists think this is part of the mission. Many do. But could the reporting lead to more violence, or could it, risk inciting more violence, could it lead to less violence? It's important to be mindful of how reporting may impact survivors, families, and communities that are already impacted by gun violence. I could go on all day about this. If anybody wants to see more, we have our parent organization, the Initiative for Better Gun Violence Reporting, has this list with some more detail on the homepage. We're a lean operation. I didn't get to make fancy slides, but you can find us. We're at ibgvr.org, and so you can view them there, communicate with us, and but at the same time, just finally, we're interested in working with everybody, whether we agree more or less, on figuring out how we can collaborate better and stop the violence.
Thank you for that. Director Atwood, if you have to drop off, it's okay, but thank you. I want to give each of you a chance to give your last remarks. I want to start with you, Ben. On everything that you've heard, everything that you've kind of taken in, what's your thoughts? And what do you want to leave our audience with?
I think that the bones are there for people who want to get out there and report this stuff accurately. My plea to this community is that we start reading past the soundbite and we start looking at contributors to these issues. You know, Erica said something very important about the correction system, and I totally agree. These are gladiator academies. No one comes out of jail better than they went into jail. But there are definite best practices that go back to places like LA, Broward County, Florida, and New York, 30 years that Philly has yet to implement. So there is no best practice facing system here to really improve upon the way things are. And people need to get past that. We need to take a serious look at the appointments. And yeah, I'm going to be more response-based because I believe deterrence is important. So we need to look at appropriate appointments to police commissioner and the egregious corruption in our district attorney's office that no one in the media seems to really want to talk about, that are contributing on a daily basis to these crimes.
Thank you for that.
When that happens, trust me, from being in Newark with Cory Booker and in New York, you know, in the mid 90s, we could get the community groups the room to breathe and start curing the sociological and criminological issues that are contributing. But until then, there needs to be some consequences on the streets.
Thank you for that. Jim, your last thoughts.
Well, you know what we've learned, from anecdotal conversations, from our focus groups with community, from our research with gunshot victims, is that I think maybe the main takeaway is that episodic reporting is harmful. That sort of reporting that says an 18-year-old male was shot at the corner of this and that, and you should be very scared. We're learning that survivors, as I said before, feel that the reporting is dehumanizing, stigmatizing, as if everyone's guilty. You know, they say that it frightens people, that sharing their medical condition it feels like an invasion of privacy, that sharing the hospital they went to can put them at real risk, that fear-mongering can lead more people to carry guns and create more problems, that sensationalized reporting can turn up the heat and turn up the social pressure to retaliate. But as Sabrina said, we also hear directly that and we heard this at the summit, that people want more information. They want to know why there aren't resources with every news report, like we see with other issues like with addiction or suicide. If you need help, call here. Here's who's here to help you. Up the Block does a great job of that, but we need to see it across the board in all local gun violence reporting. But over and over, what we're hearing is that people want solutions. They want to know what works, when it's going to happen. They want to know how they can help. And that's what aligns with our theory of change, that better informed people in communities can take action and bring about change, participate politically, hold leaders accountable, and do whatever it takes to stop the violence.
Plug your card one more time, Jim, for anybody who wants to see that.
It's true. That's right. So I brought two. I'll do this right. The Initiative for Better Gun Violence Reporting has our preliminary set of best practices. The the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting is where most of our news is happening now. This is where this is where we have our Credible Messenger Reporting Project, our Emerging Research Collaborative, and our Professional Development Program. Thanks so much.
You're one of a kind, Jim MacMillan. Sabrina.
Sure. I think I've heard a lot here that I really value. And Jim, thank you for making us all laugh. I think we all kind of needed that. I am from Philly, and being able to do a project like Up the Block is really important to me because I've been able to see that there are answers to these questions that I've always had, that my family, my friends have always had, and that people that I'm meeting on the street, talking to wherever I might find them, these resources are here. And we need to be making sure that the organizations are getting the proper, funds to be able to keep doing this, that they're getting the support they need. And that's one of the things that I really enjoy about this project, is that not only am I giving these resources to the community and trying to reach people where they're at, but I'm also able to lift up these organizations because they really do, like Jim said, they've earned the trust of the community. And that's a huge part of this.
Thank you for that. And Pastor Carl Day.
I would just say in closing, definitely was informative stuff. Great time talking with y'all. I can talk about this stuff all day with y'all. But I would close out and leave out on this. The invitation to my church doors are always open. I can be found right down 23rd in Allegheny. I'm in North Philly, been born and bred in this city. I've been on both sides of the coin. And anytime anybody from the media want to walk the streets, we can do so at night, after dark, and we can host private conversations with young people, if people really want to talk to folks that are on the grounds that really are going through a lot of this, so that we can really tap into the reality of what's going on here in Philadelphia, so that we can bring forth accountability if there's a lack of resources, or if there's a lack of responses or corruption or anything that anybody wants to address. I'm just opening that door because I'm not above talking to anybody, whether we agree or disagree. So let's hit the streets, let's talk to people, let's really be involved, let's do what we got to do. And I mean that, I stand on that, and take me up on it.
I appreciate that. Ben, we got 30 seconds.
Yeah, sorry, I missed one tag. Just wanted to tag on something Jim said. There has been a call, there's a call, some Philly journalists out of Harvard. We're seeing a resurgence in people who want to change or restrict the way crime is being reported because of the stigmas around it. And I want that to be very cautious as a journalist, because having worked in Washington, D.C., I was at the time in the 90s and early 2000s seeing a murder a night in Anacostia. And the news media there, the local media, never reported it. And yes, it's hard to deal with crime if you're in a crime-inflicted community. I lived in the River Wards for the first 10 years I was in Philly. I get that. But it's also debilitating to see bodies dropping around you, people you knew, neighbors, and hear nothing about it on the local news because they're fixated with national news. And that's the pathway DC went down when it became the murder capital in the 80s and 90s, and it still hasn't corrected itself. We do not want to end up like DC in this media market.
If I just jump in, we're not trying to stop the reporting. We're just trying to change we're trying to improve the reporting.
It's not just you. I wrote a piece about 2 Philly journalists who, through Harvard, are making a call to stop crime reporting in Philly. It's not just you. So I'm sorry if it sounded like that.
Yeah, but thank you, Ben. I think you're talking about the movement to remove the crime beat and do it differently because of the harm that the crime beat has. So they're not necessarily talking about eliminating crime reporting, but as Jim alluded to, doing it differently so that, as Sabrina alluded to, it doesn't re-traumatize folks. Listen, we could talk about this forever. You guys are really smart, really insightful people. I hope to be able to convene you guys again. You know, Ben, maybe you and I should take Pastor Carl Day up on his effort, and I'd love to kind of walk with you and come out there and check that out. And Sabrina wants to tag along, and Jim, if you're interested, come along too. Thank you for the invitation, Pastor. Jim MacMillan, Director of the Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting, Sabrina Iglesias, Community Outreach Editor for The Trace, Pastor Carl Day, activist, pastor of the Culture Changing Christian Church, A. Benjamin Manns, a media contributor to Broad and Liberty and the Philadelphia Weekly, and a former law enforcement officer, and Senior Director Erica Atwood from the Office of Criminal Justice and Public Safety for the City of Philadelphia. Thank you guys so much. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
We're going to take a quick break and come back with our second panel. I'm Christopher Norris. WHYY and 6 ABC teamed up for Confronting the Crisis, Gun Violence, a community town hall. You can watch it now at whyy.org/conversations. That's whyy.org/conversations. You're watching the Neighbors and Newsrooms Summit, fostering collaboration between residents and reporters. This event is presented by WHYY and N.I.C.E, the News and Information Community Exchange. N.I.C.E is made possible by a generous grant from the Knight Linfest Local News Transformation Fund. Welcome back. I'm Christopher Flood, the drummer Norris, WHYY's managing editor for community and engagement, and you're watching the Neighbors and Newsroom Summit. Many residents I have talked to often lament the fact that journalists only visit their neighborhoods at a time of crisis. And journalists often complain about being burdened with deadlines and not having the time or the capacity to build deep community relationships. So how do we change the way that reporters and residents interact? How do we shift the culture? That's what we'll talk about in this next panel. Allow me to introduce our panelists. Kenny Cooper is WHYY's Suburban reporter. Vanessa Maria Graber is the director of the News Voices at Free Press. Derek Kane is the community engagement editor for Resolve Philly. Madison Karras is a fellow at Resolve Philly. And Tamara POC Russell is the founder of Revive Radio and a partner with N.I.C.E. Thank you all and good afternoon. Most American adults have never met a journalist, and some would say that's indicative of how newsrooms and the profession overall works, and that is disconnected from communities. What are some strategies and ideas that you would bring to the table that would allow residents and reporters to come together in community? Vanessa, you first, and then POC.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here and share our work at Free Press. News Voices initially started just by holding town halls and listening sessions and creating networking opportunities for residents, community leaders, and journalists to meet and have food and talk about the journalistic process and also learn more about the things that are happening in the community that are often not reported in the media. And I think that, partnerships with other community-based organizations, universities, and even with elected officials could create more networking opportunities for folks to meet and, see the people who are actually writing these stories. A lot of times we see names and bylines or we hear voices, right, on NPR and WHYY, but we don't actually know who these people are. So in a way, it humanizes journalists and gives them the opportunity to tell them more about who they are. But it also gives community members to bring their message directly to the people writing these stories. So I think anytime we can introduce people to one another and allow them to start the relationship building process is the way that we can start connecting community members with journalists so that they can continue to collaborate.
Thank you for that. Vanessa, while I have you, and then, because I'm going to throw in an extra question for this first question that I didn't write down, and then I'm going to ask each of you as I go around. As I started with this segment, most American adults have never met a journalist. That's a statistic quoted by the Online News Association. If you can, in 30 seconds, tell me about the first time you met a journalist.
The first time I met a journalist, I don't know. I was involved in youth media. Which was very important in shaping my interest and involvement in making media later on. And I actually participated in a project with KYW that brought youth, Latino and Black youth into the city for a training program. So my fascination with journalists and news started at an early age. And I think we need more youth media programs like that to help students, again, understand how stories are told and what resources are available in the media to help them create content and tell their own stories.
Thank you for that. POC, the same question to you. What are some strategies and ideas that you have that would bring residents and reporters together in community? And then B, tell me about the first time you met a journalist.
Got you. Peace, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this opportunity. I would definitely say one of the biggest things that, helped to keep Revive alive this far was pretty much meeting people where they are and sparking those conscious conversations, having those conversations where the people are, not necessarily in newsrooms or behind cameras, physically going out and being a part of making the community a part of the conversation. And then also helping them to navigate through the conversation. Some types of conversations that we have in media may not go across, as well for others because they're not too familiar with what we're talking about. But helping to navigate through the conversations that we're talking about, I think will help as well and foster better ideas and new partnerships with community members when it comes down to actually reporting on what's happening in our communities, especially in Philadelphia. So I would definitely say that's one of the biggest things. And then as far as my first time meeting a journalist, I would say I was blessed because I had an internship. So I ran through, I've seen a lot of different people come through the doors at 900 AM WRD. But one of my first biggest impressions about meeting someone, who's in the journalism field was Roland Martin. He came to Philadelphia for a town hall for the school district about maybe 2-3 years ago in like 2018. And I actually seen him doing the work. Like I seen him setting up his own camera. I seen him, telling people how to make sure, we're on point, we're on cue, we have this getting done at the right time. So when I seen him actually doing the work and not just sitting back and waiting for the cue to say, and we're live, seeing him do the work, that was my biggest impression, knowing that I still had to do the work.
Thank you for that. Shout out to Roland Martin. Madison, same question to you. What are some strategies that you think about that would bring reporters and residents into community? And when's the first time you met a journalist?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Good to be here. Some strategies and ideas that I have, I guess the way I approach that question in my experience as a journalist and as a journalism supporter is I've found that journalists really need to act like and understand that people may not know how to contact them. Journalists assume and think, we have all our email addresses and our contact information listed on the internet, but that doesn't mean that people know how to take that email address and know what to contact them about and what journalists want to hear from them. So on the journalist side, I think it's really up to the journalists to, position themselves in community like a blinking light or like a little buoy out in the ocean and show people that they're there and they're showing up and available to be talked to. And on the resident side, I think it's really about them seeing that and hearing that and being like, okay, this journalist wants to hear from me. Let me go tell them what's going on in my life. We need to open up that conversation stream and give people some guidance on what we want to be hearing from them and what we want to be listening to them about. And for your second question, I was actually thinking about this before this summit earlier today. My first and only time meeting a journalist before coming into journalism myself was when I was 15 years old and I was interviewed by a local TV news reporter about a tragedy that had kind of occurred back in my hometown. And I had felt really great about the interview, but when I saw that news segment broadcasted later that day on TV, it turned out really differently than what I had expected and hoped for from that process, which has guided me into some of our work and some of the conversations we're having today.
Thank you for that. Derek Kane.
I have a lot of ideas. Thank you for today, but I can't go through it all. We don't have enough time. But I just think, again, and I share the same sentiments as everybody on the call, meeting the community where they are. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the most important things. And I think it's underrated. It sounds so simple, right? Meeting them where they are. But I think that is what brings more trust in communities because you're coming out there to talk to them in the space that they're comfortable with. That safe space is so important to a lot of folks. And I don't think journalists know or believe enough in that to do it. And I think that's one of the most important things, meeting them where they are and providing a space, a safe space that they can feel comfortable. And that's where we begin to start bridging the gap between journalists and communities. It's definitely that number one.
Yeah.
Your second question, I never really had an actual encounter, in-person encounter, but the first time I had an encounter with media in general was when I was in prison, actually. They contacted my then wife to ask about my story. They highlighted my story and they actually featured my story in an article in the Philadelphia Daily News. So that was my first interaction with media in general when they wrote a piece about and highlighted my conviction in the federal prison.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Derek. And I appreciate the tone of meeting people where they are because although news organizations may spend a lot of money on their facilities, it could also be very intimidating to ask a person to come downtown and to come meet them at a television studio when, you should come just sit on the stoop with them. Kenny Cooper, same question to you.
I think there's a great example of a newsroom that already does this work and goes out to the community. I'd like to give a shout out to the Kensington Voice. They hold these pop-up newsrooms all across the neighborhood to meet people where they are and meet people where they're comfortable. And I think that's a great example of, a newsroom that really gets it and understands the community. Now, in terms of when's the first time I met a reporter, that was actually when I was, I want to say in elementary school. I was a part of the Philadelphia Young Playwrights, I think. And we did a event at a library, at a bookstore, I think. And there were journalists there, 6ABC, I think, was there, and they were talking to us. So that was the first time I met a reporter.
Thank you for that. And I also want to shout out to Helen Yubinus to the Philadelphia Inquirer, who also does a lot of those pop-up newsrooms around her gun violence coverage. Kenny, you make me think, I've never met a journalist in elementary school, middle school, or high school. When I think about all the career days we had musicians come, we had doctors come. I never remember a journalist coming to a career day. And I think if I had, that probably would have impacted me more than I like to believe. Vanessa, we just talked about the ways of building these relationships, but now let's talk about the benefit. What's the benefit of bringing residents and reporters together in community? What would change?
Well, hopefully there's better coverage of those communities, right? Oftentimes journalists get the story wrong. They use language, vocabulary that's offensive. They talk to people who are, sources who are actually not knowledgeable. And so the idea is that, all of those things would change, right? We use language that is empowering, right? That we talk to a diversity of sources. We're not just talking to police and people working in city government or academics. We also are talking to more people of color, right? Like a lot of the times we see majority white men being used as sources, and that hopefully stories that are known in the community are being amplified and brought to light in media. The other thing we hope to see is more collaborations, right? So not an extractive process of community engagement, because that's what times we see a lot of community engagement is very performative and very extractive and very taxing on people whose communities are marginalized and exploited by media. So we want community engagement that's empowering. We want long-term relationships and more journalistic collaborations that hopefully result in media that helps communities, informs them, and addresses their information needs.
Thank you for that, Vanessa. I really appreciate the note about source diversity, but also appreciate the framing that you did of that real community engagement for a journalist can be a form of professional development, because you're understanding in real time of how to use this language and what language is harmful, right? And what language is empowering. Does anybody else want to weigh in on this particular conversation point before we move on? I see you all kind of nod in affirmation. Does anybody want to weigh in?
Yeah, definitely. I would say, when it comes down to fostering the collaborations, I would say making sure that when it comes down to the communication, making sure that we're having that conversation that people actually want to talk about. We're having that conversation that the community is actually talking about as well. So, being more of a listener than a speaker at that moment. I know we're coming in to have the conversation, but we should be listening more at that time as well.
I appreciate that. I have a question for Madison and Kenny, and then I'm coming to you, Derek. How can newsroom leadership advance these types of efforts to close the gaps between residents and reporters? Is it giving reporters less stories to cover so they have more time to build relationships? What do you see as the role of the news directors or the editors-in-chiefs or the vice presidents of news? How should they be leveraging their leadership roles to allow for this culture shift? Madison, you first, and then Kenny.
Yeah, so I definitely think this is an ongoing conversation where we, can think of ideas like, sure, maybe a few less stories a week would help, maybe some flexible deadlines that can work around a reporter or a journalist's time to go out and spend in the community. But I think the first step of that is for editors and middle management in newsrooms to be acknowledging that, yes, the journalist's role is a professional communicator, a professional storyteller, and a professional writer, but it's also a professional relationship builder, and that takes relationship maintenance into the job description and into the practice. So it may be understanding, okay, let me give this reporter an extra hour because they went and took somebody out for lunch today. Let this reporter work remotely from a coffee shop out in a community that they're covering so that people see them and know their presence and identify that. So, I think depending on the newsroom, depending on what type of content you're producing, there is a whole range of options we can talk about there for how middle management and how our editor-in-chiefs can support journalists in this community engagement.
Thank you for that. Kenny Cooper.
Yeah, I think flexible deadlines is definitely a great, way to allow newsrooms to do this engagement work kind of unhindered by, the normal deadlines of normal stories, especially when you're first starting a beat, building up that beat and making sure that you establish that trust with the community and, just identify yourself takes time. Just letting people know who you are and where you cover and what stories you cover takes time. It's not something you can just jump in and immediately do and expect great results. You kind of have to invest in the community, invest in your platform, and just make sure that people know who you are just before you can even get out there and start reporting stories. And, like Madison was just saying, trust isn't always just about, okay, here's a story. It's those moments where, hey, you're having a conversation with this person for an hour. Hey, you're talking on the phone. You're meeting them out somewhere where they can explain something that may not always yield a story, but it fosters a relationship.
I appreciate that.
I want to add to that. I want to add to that and say, what would it mean if when we hired young reporters and new reporters to a newsroom, we gave them 2 to 3 weeks as a part of that onboarding process to establish and build their source database and build those relationships in a community? Because that could be a whole game changer for the sustainability of that role, of that beat, and of that coverage zone, as Kenny was just saying.
No, I appreciate that. We have a gun violence reporter starting soon, and that person's first month will not be about trying to turn a story around and turn out, but it's go in the neighborhoods where this is happening and get to know people. One of the things that I was doing when I ran my own shop, and I know Vanessa was doing back in the Occupy Philly days, is sometimes it's just showing up. You don't even take your camera out of your bag. You literally just show up. People recognize your face, and eventually they may come to you. Man, I see you at these protests all the time, and what is your name? Right, and that's how it used to come to me, because I had this little camera, and people would I had to catch myself, and people had to, people would be like, "Yo, you always come here with this little camera, like, what's your name?" And I would introduce myself, and this starts this conversation. And one of the things that they would do is then say, "You got to meet this person." And I think that's when you know that you're in the groove, is when somebody connects you with somebody else, because that's a really good sign of trust. POC, I know you wanted to say something, then Vanessa, if you wanted to react, and then I'll go to Derek. Go ahead, POC.
You pretty much took it right out of my mouth. I feel like when it comes down to editors and producers, if they put a lot more trust into, the field reporters and the journalists who are actually going out and doing the story, when actually putting the story together and coming up with different ideas of how the story can be expressed and shown to the world, just putting a little bit more trust into the reporter and trusting that what they have given you and turned in is something that will be successful.
Thank you for that. Vanessa, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll say in my experience now, like training and consulting with newsrooms, is that we often interface with young staff of color who a lot of the labor is put on them to do this work. And it's really unfair at times, right? That work needs to be equally distributed throughout a news organization, and it needs to start from the top, right? So editors and other leadership, they need to be the ones who are leading that process, and it needs to be part of a larger strategy, not piecemealed and not done in small waves. And so I would encourage newsroom leaders to really build that into their year-long planning process and even 5-year strategic plan. And I think that one of the other things that's a major barrier is that editors and leadership are often far removed from the community. So the on-the-ground work that happens in the streets when you're interfacing people is often misunderstood and not fully realized by people who spend a lot of their time in the office, on their laptops, not interfacing with the public on a daily basis.
Thank you for that. Derek, so much of what we've been talking about is changing cultures and reforming newsrooms and trying to overturn outdated systems of work. And this is a question I'd love for you guys to jump into if you hear it, particularly you, Kenny. But is there anything about how journalism works with the public today that's worth keeping in place?
Yes, I think one of the most important things that in the journalism process is journalists going out into the community. We've seen a taste of that now with the coronavirus and how a lot of times now journalists have to, do a lot of their interviews via Zoom. I think if we were to get rid of the one-on-one conversations between journalists and communities out in the community would be detrimental. So I think that would be something that is important and should always be there. And I think that, because think about it, the journalism depends on the people it aims to serve, right? That's the initial thing. The original purpose is to give information so that they can better navigate through society. And what's the better way of doing that than doing it in person, I think. So I would not want to see where newsrooms would stop their journalists going out in the community to talk to community members.
That's actually a really good answer. That's not what I think you were going, but that's a very simple thing of like that. The thing that works is the deployment, right? Yeah. You go out into the communities, and that is part of it. Because I'll tell you what, if you're not going out to a community, I always say that you're publishing. You're not doing journalism. You're just publishing content to the web. Kenny, anything about journalism that should stay in place as we talk about, overturning cultures and moving away with outdated systems? What about journalism today works?
Well, just to add balance to that point about going out to the community, I do think it's important to keep these, I guess, virtual digital avenues open. You may not always get the people, that you think you can reach by just going out there. Sometimes people are at work during the times that I'm working. And by the time they get home, I'm off my shift. So if we didn't have that digital avenue open to talk, it'd be impossible to include them in a story. And it also just helps me be at more places than once. I do think the digital, age of journalism definitely helps bring in more stories and more voices, particularly working class voices of color that you may not get during the workday because they're working. And allows you to really access a new, I guess, type of story that you wouldn't have gotten if you were just sticking to the 9 to 5, confines of, okay, I'm going to go out for a few hours, where you're only accessing that, group of people that's available during that few hours. And, I think it's important to do both, going out and deploying yourself, but also leaving these, I guess, nets open and casting these digital nets to get people that, normally you would not have been able to talk to. And you really get a great deal of stories when you do that.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Can I just say something real
Sure,
quick?
go ahead,
Just
Derek.
push back a little bit on Kenny.
Okay.
The digital divide is real in the city, and that's the thing about it. Yeah, I definitely agree that we should have those avenues open, but a lot of times, especially when I'm going out in communities, a lot of the people that I talk to, they don't have that great internet access a lot of times, and they don't really deal with the Zooms and stuff like that. So I definitely believe having it open having that as an option is there, but I still don't think, I think if we had to do like a percentage, I would say 70-30 on 70 going out in the community, 30% only if you can't get to go out in the community.
Okay. POC?
I was going to say, this conversation is a conversation that is always talked about as far as, how can we merge the generation gap? Because that's pretty much what it sounds like when he made the point of saying not many people want to get on the Zooms, but if you think about millennials and Zs, that's what we want to do. We'd rather do that virtual than going in person because we only got to get dressed from the top up, but when it comes down to media, the 19-year-old in me is like, yes, I want to keep it the way that it is because this is what I fell in love with. But at the same time, it's like time has changed, innovation has changed, and we have to keep up with it. So look at us right now being on this panel. Many people are viewing it on Facebook Live, so that avenue and opening that door helps us to become global and, international. So keeping it the way it is great, but at the same time, we're going to miss a lot of curves as far as the virtual wave that is coming through, especially with Metaverse as being something of a topic of discussion now as well.
Thank you for that. Madison, Vanessa, did you want to weigh in on this point as well? About
think,
anything that's working?
I just think of both of these as tools, and it's understanding who you're talking to and understanding where they're at. Like I've talked to a lot of journalists who, thinking of the digital divide, right? They'll go out, they'll spend all this time with people, they'll talk with people, report on their story, and then they'll go back to them. And if this person, doesn't have access to see the broadcast, they'll go and show them it. Like, hey, here's what came of this piece, right? That's one way we could do it. And another way I've heard during, this time of disconnection is, especially COVID, like we're all kind of misplaced, is journalists using these platforms, using these tools to keep up and show people that, hey, I'm still interested in you. Let me comment on your dog pictures on Instagram. Let me comment on your work anniversary on LinkedIn. Like just showing that there's a relationship there and understanding where that message is going and how the person's going to get it.
Thank you for that. Vanessa, you're all about the revolution, but is there anything that you want to keep in place?
Well, I would say right now, there is just a lot of language and policy changes that are happening that are rooted in community media. And if folks don't know, my background is in the media justice and community media movement. So I am really thrilled when mainstream or legacy media starts to adopt our narratives and our language, right? That's some measure of success. Where, even 10 years ago, community engagement journalism was not a real thing, but it was something that was practiced, and really inherent of the culture of community and independent media. So I'm happy to see that. And I also want to really applaud local foundations for stepping up and making a larger investment into independent media and Black and Latinx media here in the city, and also the investment in young journalists and creating fellowships and scholarships, because those are opportunities that we didn't have When I was starting out in my career, it was very difficult being a young Latina trying to break into these newsrooms, and seeing those spaces being carved out and seeing millions of dollars being invested into starting alternative media outlets and investing in entrepreneurship, I think is reaping the rewards right now. And so I'd like to continue to see larger investments in that, especially here locally in the Delaware Valley.
I appreciate that. I'm going to go with each of you to get a little bit more about your individual projects and your individual work. Kenny, let me start with you. You found non-traditional ways to interact with residents via Facebook and Harken. Can you tell us a little bit about your strategy? What's been the response from the communities you cover? And if there, in particular, is there any story that you have published that you would not have been able to get without a community member's help?
Yeah, definitely. So I was hired by WHYY back in November of 2020. And those first few months, I was, working mostly virtual because that was the height of the pandemic. I wasn't really doing much in community reporting, partially because I was new. My great editor, Joanne McLaughlin, and our audience engagement specialist, Aaron Reynolds, had this great idea of using Harken, which is a tool that we use to gather audience questions for some other stories, to cover the suburbs, which is what I cover. Being someone that lives in Cheltenham, from the Cheltenham area, and just stayed local, this was really a great tool for me to connect with my neighbors, in a sense, because those are my neighbors. So I covered Delco and Montco. And basically, the question that we started off is, what do you wonder about the suburbs? And that's what we wanted to ask our audience members. And it wasn't just important about asking our existing audience members that question. It was also, expanding that audience and talking to different groups of people. So one way that I got out the message was that I joined the Facebook groups of, all the municipalities that I cover, which if you add up, Delco and Montco together, that's 100+ municipalities, 100+, townships, boroughs, things like that. And I tried to get as many as I possibly could and drop that message in there and join them and introduce myself and say, hey, I covered the suburbs. I'm from this area. And I know you guys have questions about this, that, and the third. I've already been covering some of these things, but I want to hear from you. And the amount of responses that we got were, just ridiculously good in terms of, hey, there's this thing happening in our community. I think you should check it out. There's this thing, I think you should check it out. And it yielded a great deal of stories that I think we would not have gotten any other way. And it also allowed me to multitask in terms of choosing, what things I'm going to cover. So a lot of the Harken stories were, stories that I would take a little bit more time of, so I could still do those community stories and go out and visit people and talk to people. Also, covering the day-to-day grind of, okay, this just happened today in Upper Darby, or this just happened today in Montgomery County as a whole. I need to cover that right now. And it yielded great stories. I think one story that I thought was particularly timely was the critical race theory debate that was happening at school boards across the country. And this story took me to Souderton. It was a resident that reached out and said, hey, you should check this out. There's this, growing divide between community members in the Souderton area, and they formed these rival Facebook groups. We're having a school board meeting coming up soon. Just watch, listen. And I did that and wrote a story about it. And I don't think we would have gotten that story if not for, that Harken, project that we've been doing. And there's a bunch of stories like that. There was the Buy Nothing story about Buy Nothing groups that I didn't know much about, heading into it, but there was a resident in Lansdowne that was like, hey, the Lansdowne area has a great Buy Nothing group. I think you should check it out. Of course, my question was, what's a Buy Nothing group? And I did this deep dive into, this gift-giving economy where people were just super generous to each other and were offering up things. And there was this mother and daughter duo that had set up a food pantry on their porch during the pandemic so people could come up and just literally drop off things, pick up things, no questions asked. And those are the type of stories that, were yielded from that. And I was able to go out and go literally neighbor to neighbor. And they literally gave me a tour of the neighborhood and, the walking paths and driving paths they take, like, oh, just head up there. You can follow me in my car. We're going to drive to this person's house and watch this drop off and this pickup. And it was just a great story. So those are the types of stories that I was able to get from that. And it can be anything as, nice as, people giving gifts to each other, to as serious as critical race theory debates at school boards, to as historical as, the media break-in at the FBI office in media 50 years ago. So those are the types of stories we've been able to uncover with that, and it's been great.
Thank you for that, Kenny. I appreciate it. Madison, you're working on an interesting project around sourcing and teaching. I believe it's called the Source Transparency Project. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So at Resolve, I'm working on a project that kind of gets at what you said at the beginning of this conversation, which is that most Americans and people haven't met a journalist before. And same goes for that most people have not spoken to a journalist before or been interviewed by a journalist before for a news story or knows what goes into the production of a news story. You know, and why should they? This is not something that's taught in K through 12 education, how to talk to the press, right? So the project that I'm working on focuses on what happens between a journalist and a resident when a journalist goes to interview a resident who hasn't spoken to the media before or has very little media experience. Because that's a whole new ballgame, that's a whole new experience for this resident, and the conversation has a whole different, you know, it plays out differently. There's on the record and off the record, and there's things to learn about this journalist and their publication. So in an interview between a journalist and a resident, you know, the resident's going to be sharing what their story is, what their experience is, and what their thoughts on the reporter's reporting is. But it's also where a resident's going to be learning about who the journalist is, what their publication is, and what that story publication process is. So they're making a decision about what and if they're going to trust this journalist and their publication. So the project that I'm working on is figuring out what needs to happen between that journalist and that resident to ensure that there's trust there and ensure that they're coming to that conversation with the same information and expectations about that interview, because we know that if they come to the conversation and those are mismatched, that's where distrust and disconnect between newsrooms and residents can happen.
Thank you for that. Very thoughtful project, I believe. Looking forward to seeing how it grows. Vanessa, the work you oversee with News Voices is all about building power with communities so residents have a stronger voice in how journalism is shaped. What are the biggest challenges you're facing in this work? And more importantly, how do you know when you're successful?
Thanks for that question. I think the biggest challenge now, well, there's two. One is that, you know, because of the long history of harm to BIPOC communities and other underrepresented groups, there is a large distrust of media. So a lot of times we're having to facilitate repair to the harm that's been done and finding ways to acknowledge that harm, which some newsrooms can be really resistant to. You might say, well, I just started here. It's not my fault that these stories were published, and I'm not like that. And so you're often having to take into account, you know, 100 years of reporting that hasn't served communities. So we're currently working on a restorative justice guide for journalists to think about the ways that we can learn about restorative justice as a practice to navigate these conversations and building relationships with communities, to rebuild that trust slowly over time. And that's the other downside, right? It takes a long time to earn respect and trust, and journalists have to learn how to be patient in doing that. Even though they might not have contributed to that problem, they exist within a context in which they have to acknowledge it and answer for it. I think the other big problem that we have when it comes to addressing information needs, especially around the pandemic, and I did a lot of work on election coverage, is disinformation, especially in Spanish language, right? With our Latinx community, we have to spend a lot of time clarifying, verifying information instead of being able to focus on stories and amplifying stories that the community wants and needs. And so it you know, takes capacity to address disinformation. And I think there's a lot of media literacy that needs to be taught to people to understand the journalistic process so that when they they're upset about an opinion piece that's written in a newspaper, that they understand the difference between a reporter going out into the community and doing a factual report. I think there's still a lot of confusion between blogs and podcasts and who's a journalist and who's not a journalist. So again, those things take a lot of capacity, you know, and as Madison mentioned, they're young people are not being taught that, and yet they have more access to news and information than ever. So sorting through all these different things, you know, the distrust and the disinformation and who's an actual journalist and who's not, takes a lot of time and patience. But I think the benefit is that once you sort of start to have these conversations about how media is created and how media functions as an institution, that people start to want to educate and learn more and become part of that process.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. POC, you interact with residents regularly to produce your segment, Matter Nah. It's often quick meetings to get the reaction to the news of the day. Tell me a little bit about what your ideal long-term relationship with residents would look like, and how do you plan to achieve that?
Matter Nah is truly, you know, something that was started out of the pandemic as well. So for it to be going on this long and, you know, thinking about a long-term version of it is just something that's truly exciting to me. You know, when it comes down to Matter Nah, it's something I want to expand in so many different facets, you know, maybe going out into the suburbs, you know, going out into the Delaware Valley area as well to be able to, you know, talk to them and know what's happening in their community and what probably makes them mad, you know, and not all the subjects or topics that we pick are honed directly into what's happening in Philadelphia. Some of it's national news. So being able to take Matter Nah on a national scale as well, being able to get opinions from people not just in the Philadelphia region, but maybe in the tri-state area, going into that new South Jersey, Delaware area too. So being able to just expand it and get more conversation and more feedback from everyone, you know, who's truly listening and supporting the segment.
Thank you for that. And finally, Derek Kane, one of the things that I first interacted with you was your Reframe project with Resolve. How do you feel like your work contributes to this culture shift that we've been talking about, and how do you know when you're successful?
Thanks for the question, Chris. I think it's to Vanessa's point and everybody on the panel's point, like thinking about it from the perspective of, you know, putting in the work, right? Building the trust, building those relationships with communities. But it's also, for me, I'm tasked with building relationships with the journalists as well and to bridge that gap. And thinking about it from that perspective, it's really thinking how the best way to connect with communities that makes sense and is authentic to the communities that you serve. And I think for me and what we do at Resolve, I think that's a huge mission for us. And Reframe is that initiative that talks about language and just understanding and knowing, you know, the language that the communities identify with and the language that they trust. If you don't speak that language, then you're not going to get in that community, or they're not going to trust you. So starting with just how this community communicates with each other and how they want to be known, or, you know, for example, there was back in 2019, it was when the police officers got shot up off Germantown and Erie. I mean, off Broad and Erie. When they were doing the coverage on it, they were putting out their North Philly. And I had to talk to a couple community members that was from the Strawberry Mansion section, but it's not over there. And they were saying that how people outside of the city would call up to him and say, hey, you know, you guys are all right? They said, we're shooting at 6 cops got shot in North Philly. He's like, I live in North Philly, but that's not my area. Just knowing where you're reporting at and understanding the fact that the community identifies as this is the name of the community that I'm reporting in. Just having that, you know, talking about language and identification and authenticity, that's the part of building relationships. So that's what I'm tasked to deal with every day on a day-to-day basis. And it's definitely a process. And I think that's what a lot of our work is just working through those processes and also thinking of it as a marathon, not a sprint. And what I see that is, well, how I identify or look at myself or think about it as being successful is when a community member comes up to me and says, hey, you know what? There was a piece that was written here that was pretty good. And, you know, and I know we had a conversation about it in one of your previous sound offs. And it looks like these legacy journalism newsrooms are starting to listen. You know, it's not turned over yet. It's not where we want it to be yet, but it's a start. And when I hear that from community members, then that lets me know that I'm doing my job. And hopefully we can continue to do it and be successful in the future.
Thank you. I've gotten a chance to talk with each one of you individually. I think you guys are all brilliant. Appreciate all the work that you guys do. We're out of time for this segment, but thank you so much. Kenny Cooper of WHYY, Vanessa Maria Graber of News Voices and Free Press, Derek Kane, Community Engagement Editor at Rizal Philly, POC, founder of Revive Radio, and Madison Karras, Fellow at Rizal Philly. Thank you so much, guys. Have a good afternoon.
Peace.
We're going to take a quick station identification break, and then we'll be back with the main event, a conversation roundtable about N.I.C.E, moderated by Roxanne Stafford. You're watching the Neighbors and Newsroom Summit, fostering collaboration between residents and reporters. This event is presented by WHYY and N.I.C.E, the News and Information Community Exchange. N.I.C.E is made possible by a generous grant from the N.I.C.E Local News Transformation Fund. And welcome back. I'm Christopher Flood, the drummer Norris, Managing Editor for Community and Engagement here at WHYY. WHYY's News and Information Community Exchange, or N.I.C.E, has been written about, talked about, and profiled and awarded. And it's only been in existence for a year. So what's the origin story? What's been the impact on the organization and the partners? And what's the future of this mutual aid approach to journalism? This is the topic of our final panel of the afternoon, and moderating this conversation isn't me, but Roxanne Stafford, the Managing Director of the N.I.C.E Local News Transformation Fund, which is a $20 million initiative that works to empower local news organizations to build trust in their communities while producing outstanding journalism and developing new revenue streams that can enable them to reach long-term sustainability. Welcome, please, Roxanne Stafford.
Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. Thank you so much, Chris. I am truly looking forward to help bring this summit home in this session. It is wonderful to be in community with all of you and take this journey that is N.I.C.E. As Chris shared, my name is Roxanne Stafford. I'm the Managing Director of the N.I.C.E Local News Transformation Fund. We are an independent joint venture of the Knight Foundation and N.I.C.E Institute. And since our beginning in 2019, we have taken a mutual aid approach to journalism where we see news and information as a vehicle for solidarity. So we're excited to be able to get deep into what that means through N.I.C.E. To further set the tone of this conversation, I want to share some words from science fiction author Octavia Butler. Now, when Butler was asked for advice on predicting the future, she said this: "There's no single answer that will solve all of our future problems. There's no magic bullet. Instead, there are thousands of answers. At least you can be one of them if you choose to be." Now, when I think of folks who have actively, and I mean this, actively chosen to be a part of setting a more just future, the N.I.C.E Collective, the N.I.C.E partners definitely come to mind. And I would love to kick this off by having all of you quickly go around and briefly introduce yourself and your media news org, but more importantly, briefly tell folks, what does N.I.C.E mean to you? And maybe we can begin with you, Sandy, and then everyone else can follow.
Well, thank you, Roxanne. It's really great having you moderate this panel, as well as supporting the N.I.C.E project. Beyond supporting the N.I.C.E project, and we'll talk about the origin story too, which is something I love to share. But the work we've been doing at WHYY, I've been in local news business for a long time, and looking at the reforms that have to happen in journalism, reforms that have to happen in our newsrooms, that's the work we've been doing at WHYY. This is part of a process, right? It's looking at our source diversity and tracking it every single day, really trying to create a culturally competent newsroom. But the missing piece is also joining together with local grassroots creators who also are doing journalism or acts of journalism every single day. And so what N.I.C.E means to me is the sustainability of journalism. It sounds like a big thing, but I think we'll see in our conversation exactly what I mean about that.
All right, the sustainability of journalism. I know folks' ears have perked up if they hadn't already. Chris, what does NICE mean to you?
I think NICE is, NICE is an acknowledgement that communities are not just consumers of news and information, but producers of it too. NICE is an indication that the future of journalism is people.
Very true. People, sustainability. I'm loving this, how this is building. Eric, by way of introduction, can you help break this down even more, right? What does NICE mean to you?
Yes, well, thank you, Roxanne. I'm really happy to be here with you and all the support that you've given, and particularly with the other panelists here. I just can't tell you, it's transformational. So again, my name is Eric Marsh. I'm the community outreach organizer for WHYY. And what NICE means to me, I was thinking about it. I actually got to come up with some of my own sayings because Chris took one of the best ones, which is the future of journalism is people. And I think the future is also NICE. The way we have been able to connect, identify, and coordinate with these hyper-local creators around the Philadelphia region has just been transformational. And so I really, it means so much to me. It really is the future. So absolutely excited about this conversation.
Love this, the connecting, the coordinating, the identifying, right? Those are such powerful words to build on that momentum. I love for Conrad, if you could break it down even further and introduce yourself so that people can hear what you've been up to and what NICE means to you and your amazing work.
Sure, yeah. So my name is Conrad Benner, and I run a blog called Streets Department that highlights and celebrates, documents, and investigates Philadelphia's public art and Philadelphia's public space. These are important conversations, I believe, because our public space is for all of us. And for me, as one of these independent journalists, a part of the NICE program, NICE to me means community. It means support from one of the most important legacy media institutions in Philadelphia. And I think for both me as an independent journalist and for WHYY, it's about bursting out of this bubble, right? We're all in these little journalism bubbles. And when we can sort of work together, we can better serve our communities and our own businesses.
Ooh, I'm already seeing that image and that importance of bursting out of that bubble. And I love what you're saying, that it's not you alone. You got to have a collective to be able to get out of that bubble. And speaking of somebody that you would want to have in your collective, last but definitely not least, Purple, please introduce yourself. And what does NICE mean to you?
Mwah. Peace and greetings. My name is Sajda Purple Blackwell, and I am the founder of PQRadio1.com. I am the first Black female to bring an internet radio station to community. And I'm very proud of it, where I am able to uplift other voices like mine who are independent, who are people who commit acts of journalism, or who just want to have a dream to be in broadcast. And what NICE means to me is very, very clear. It's empowerment. It's empowerment of the little Black girl with a dream who never thought her dream would come into fruition, but always worked hard to make sure that it does come to fruition, but to have that kind of support from NICE and a mainstream network is amazing. And if I can do it, you can do it.
All right, I heard that call to action. It's beautiful for us to all be stepping into that collective dream, and especially the dreams of Black folks. So thank you so much, Purple. Sandy, we've heard so many different ways in which folks are describing NICE. Again, from bursting the bubble, fulfilling dreams, a way in which legacy media can truly show up and support others. It is about the future, which is people in journalism. And obviously you had a nod to sustainability. Can you take us back to the beginning, right? I'm not sure if these words were a part of that origin story, although I do feel like, they're in the DNA, so to speak. Can you share a little bit with us about where NICE came from?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, NICE actually, the origin story is NICE came, an idea that I had from Chris Norris. Chris and I were talking one day, and Chris, as you've heard in other panels, was an independent journalist, right? He was there doing journalism his kind of way, and not necessarily the kind of way that most journalists do every single day. But legacy newsrooms, including WHYY, I heard from journalists saying like, well, he's not a real journalist, and so when I thought about the kinds of barriers that we need to break through, because the key to sustainability is creating, embedding practices in what you do every single day and changing our perceptions. It's a progression of different kinds of work internally. And so I thought like, well, let's, I know there's more Chris Norrises out there. And so let's create a project, right, that recognizes local creators who are dedicated to their communities, who are unseen, often unheard by us, not necessarily our communities, by us. Let's create a project around that. And one of the most valuable parts of this is I kind of, threw the seed out. Chris and I, as usual, we call it jamming. So we just kind of jam some ideas. And then, the work that we did with you, Roxanne, in terms of really thinking through this and whiteboarding these thoughts and where are we trying to get to was really valuable. So that's the origin story of N.I.C.E.
I love that you all were able to, from the get-go, recognize that to Purple's points, the dreams were already out there, right? The capacity was always present. It was about giving yourself the ability to bring that in and grow and evolve with that, which is why it's hard to believe, to Chris's earlier point, N.I.C.E. has been around a little bit over a year, right? To have been able to do so much. And I want to turn to some of our partner members that weren't in our original whiteboard session, but we were dreaming them up and hoping to connect to their dreams and hear a little bit about, what their experience has been. So maybe I'll start with you, Conrad. How has it been being a part of N.I.C.E. and in what ways has it helped or affected, I should say, the ways in which you show up and you run your own organization?
Yeah, whenever we sort of reflect on N.I.C.E, because it's been over just about a year now, I always say this first and foremost, like it is like this little, church meeting every Friday. We get together and for an hour and a half, we kind of shoot the breeze. And that alone is really restorative. I say this over and over again, all of our organizations, there's 12 of us, we're all different sizes and have different employees. I work for myself and I have 2 sort of part-time employees. So all of us though are pretty small bubbles. So when we can sort of get together and hear, what is Purple going through, not only in, the stories that Purple is trying to work on and trying to report on, but sort of the back end business stuff that is often so confusing. It's confusing period right now because the environment and the economy is changing so quickly, so often, especially for this industry. But as independent creators, we can learn not only from WHYY, but from each other continually and constantly. And I like being in sort of constant connection with these folks. And I never want it to go away. Never. I hope it doesn't.
That's so beautiful. And I love this notion of being in church or being in a place where one can commune and have that restorative spirit. How about for you, Purple? What has it been like being a part of this collective?
I know that everyone's journey is not the same, and but I am reeling in excitement of everything that N.I.C.E. has given me more opportunity to do. I am one of the people I truly believe in breaking the glass ceiling whenever possible. Go for it, get the camera, break the glass ceiling, and that is exactly what N.I.C.E. is, right? And has become it. N.I.C.E. has broken the glass ceiling across the nation. How amazing to be one of the first. I pride myself on being the first of a lot of things. First on a radio station, first woman to do this, first this and that. So to be a part of this first is amazing. And when you're used to working in your silos, because we're always working in our silos, right? And before we even knew that there were all these other content creators in your silo, you probably don't even know. I didn't even never heard of Conrad, but he's one of the biggest, most amazing people in Philadelphia. You know what I'm saying? Like I've never known of Steve and Carol, the Northwest local, James Williams. I'm known as James Williams, of course, but these people who I now have access to, like I said, we get a chance to kind of hear each other's stories and see what we're going through and say, you know what, oh my God, I'm not by myself. There are other people who are also experiencing this as they're laying the foundation for greatness and laying foundation for community and community news to be important to everybody and not just to community. So making that transformation and meeting others who do the same has been
That's a beautiful dramatic pause of amazing, right? And that foundation that you speak of and those great shout outs to the partners, we couldn't get to that place without having someone like Eric. And so Eric, again, just as helping folks understand the origin of the journey that we've been going on for almost a little bit over a year, I know you often talk about, and I so appreciate this, the disconnect that often happens between journalists and community partners, right? This summit is about relationship building and bringing folks together, just as Conrad and Purple have said. I was hoping you could share some insights, especially given the work that you're doing to not only make NICE happen, but really think about what is this process when we talk about mutual aid that requires individual transformation just as much as the group?
Yeah, well, let me just take a step back and refer to Conrad's mention of little church group, right? One of the things that I tell the partners all the time is that our meetings really do feel, the whole purpose of the meeting, besides skill building, is fellowship, right? And so in terms of this disconnect between newsrooms and local creators, I mean, look at who we're talking to. How could you not want a fellowship with somebody like Purple and somebody like
There you go, yes.
and all the other amazing partners, right? So, I mean, just the energy, the talent, the drive, the insight that the partners bring, I think lends itself to better journalism, right? Because journalism at its core is storytelling. We're telling community members the stories of what's happening that's near and dear to them. And I haven't seen anyone that does it better and with more passion and conviction than many of these NICE partners. And so in terms of that disconnect between communities and journalists or legacy organizations, you know, I really think part of it goes back to the failure of news institutions to put people first over profits, right? To understand that, yes, news is business, but oftentimes what we've seen transpire over the last decade or two, or maybe more, is the business has taken over the importance of storytelling and importance of transferring information to community and residents. And something that, again, I'm gonna steal another saying from Chris, the reality is that, you know, communities are not just consumers of news, they're creators of it as well. And so who better to tell their own stories than the people who are central to those communities?
Absolutely. Since we're giving some props to our brother Chris, I want to bring you back into this conversation, especially as we reflect on what it means for a legacy organization to be participating in something like this. Reflecting also on the fact that, as Sandy mentioned, you know, you're an inspiration as a community-based content creator. And so we'd love for you to talk a little bit more about, you know, what changes have you seen in WHYY based on NICE?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And listen, let me just say that people are still asking me, they really hired you over there? And I was like, go talk to Sandy about that. And I would just say that, you know, if I wasn't working here, I would want to be in NICE, you know, because when I was running TechBook for 10 years, you know, Conrad spoke to this, the level of isolation you experience when working in the grassroots, that I always say that the promise of NICE really is the network, because there's so much value in just being in fellowship and community with each other, that the collaborations and the cross-pollination of content will happen organically. But it's more important that people know that others exist in this space that have a similar lived experience that you can tap into for inspiration and encouragement. In terms of what I've seen at WHYY is just, it's no longer engagement that's acknowledging the value of citizen journalism, of grassroots content. I think now our editors and our reporters realize that this is not about competition, this is about complement, right? It's a complementary infrastructure that can support and advance what we do rather than compete. And so what we see now in the newsroom is certain stories will come up And an editor unprompted will go, hey, do we have a NICE partner who might be able to do this? Or hey, which NICE partner do you think would want to do this? Is Purple out in West Philly today? Do you think we could tap into her? I mean, and Purple has tapped in and got us interviews that, frankly, we would not have been able to get on our own.
There you go.
Conrad has bought a perspective and voice that we would not have gotten by trying to manufacture on our own. And the same is true for POC and for others. And so I think it's really the biggest change is the acknowledgement now extends beyond engagement and has become part of the newsroom. And you got to give the credit to Sandy Clark, because that's her vision of embedding that level of making sure that this is not just the engagement's job, but that engagement is the job of everyone who works here.
Yes. Chris, I love how you're adding to the list of important C's that Eric kicked us off with around connecting and coordinating and complement or complementary being one. I hope folks are taking notes or diagramming this, because this will help lead a pathway for how you want to approach this work and identify greats like Purple and Conrad in your community. Sandy, I want to come back to you on this notion of the newsroom in and of itself. Again, Conrad raised the point that this is a new type of relationship with a legacy-based organization. Sandy, you also shared as part of the origin story that we've been talking about this, drawing, diagramming, dreaming about this actually since 2019, right? Pre-pandemic, around this notion of mutual aid. Can you share some tidbits or insights that you observed, for our legacy folks who may be tuning in and are wanting to figure out how they should be showing up now?
Yeah, one of the things that Conrad was talking about was, and we're having all these discoveries and revelations as this work goes, which is one of the beauties of it, is, talking about being in the bubble, right, as an independent producer, and Chris talking about how it's some kind of solitary work. Big newsrooms, I think it's not from lack of will and intention in many cases, where we are seeing a generation of journalists who do want to be more engaged and who do want to get out there. We are in our own bubble, right? But, there's these unrelenting demands of news, necessitates us to really look at our structure, look at where our priorities are. And so I think, part of that is really important, is how do we're trying to help everybody kind of come to the well together. And that requires certain decisions and priorities from us as a newsroom. Earlier in one of the conversations, somebody mentioned about how important it was to have leadership that supported this and would not let it go. And I did not introduce myself. I'm the VP for News and Civic Dialogue at WHYY. And it is really important to have leadership that not only just, looks at initiatives and says go, but is there all the time, in conversation with our partners, as well as those who are executing the work. So, that's critical. If we want to talk about sustainability, then we have to have commitment from the very top.
Very good.
Not at the very top, but almost.
Yeah, top in my book. The connection, right, to sustainability and governance is so important. And I want to draw another connection to that, which is understanding the lived experience. And I want to start talking about this in particular with you, Purple, and then Conrad. Purple, I always appreciate you often speak about the importance of the lived experience and making sure that the truth of communities is at the center of everything that you do and what journalism needs to be. I was wondering if you could share with folks, how has this been a hallmark of your work and how it's shown up as you being a part of N.I.C.E, this notion of the lived experience and the truth of communities shining through.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Roxanne. You're doing an amazing job, by the way. But lived experiences it's extremely important in communication. Truth is extremely important in communication. Many people, especially in my community, don't trust the news. We don't trust politicians. We don't trust pretty much anybody or anything, So when you have the ability to communicate to people and they trust you, it's such an important and amazing, gambit in life to have somebody to trust you. So when I'm watching the news, I want to be able to trust the information that's there, but I'm not quite sure where their resources are coming from, right? And when I know, maybe in the hood, they said, unfortunately, like with gun violence, this person got shot and, they don't have any motives. Well, a lot of people in the hood, we have the motive. We know what's going on. We heard about that shooting. We know the cousin of the person who shot that person, and sometimes we get it before the, legacy news medias get it and get it correct. So it is important, extremely important for me to just be able to do that. And on my platform, I do something a little bit different, whereas I lift up politicians and communities so that they can join together, so community can understand politics. A lot of times it's like, you're looking at the and it's gibberish to you, but I break it down. When I'm talking to the mayor, I want you to understand what the mayor is saying, and hear him talking regular talk. People don't get a chance to hear the mayor talk regular, and sometimes until they come to my platform. And that is the kind of transition that I would like in difference in legacy media and grassroots, where I think it can be marriaged to be better.
I love that. And a good marriage always takes work. Conrad, I want to bring you into this conversation as well. It's not a given that the lived experience is actually going to be honored in the right way. You all have this opportunity, as you've laid out so far in our conversation, via N.I.C.E to really explore, interrogate, and figure out, can that be possible? Can it happen? And can we do that as a collective? So would love to hear your thoughts on lived experience and the truth coming from the communities.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to approach a question like this, but what's come to mind in this moment is, I think legacy news organizations have a lot of responsibility to put a spotlight on what's newsworthy, right? Press conferences from the mayor, XYZ. And I think what a lot of the community partners do with a lot of the cohorts with N.I.C.E do is put a spotlight where maybe necessarily there wouldn't be otherwise, right? And that often is the lived experience. So one of the first pieces of content I worked on in conjunction with WHYY was a piece around the lack of public restrooms here in Philadelphia. So my blog, Streets Department, focuses on art in the public space primarily and public space more broadly. So I do talk about parks and stuff like that. But working with WHYY was an opportunity to go that extra mile and work with editors at the organization to investigate, why don't we have this lack of basic public infrastructure? There's 1.6 million of us, 1.6 million of us, and we all got to use the bathroom. Where are they? And I think COVID has really shine a light on that we've been relying on business infrastructure to host whatever a handful of public restrooms exist, coffee shops, bookstores, that we also learned in 2020 are limited to certain groups of people, or certain groups of people are less invited to those spaces. So I think the lived experience deserves much more of a highlight. There are things that people deal with every day, engage with every day, and they don't see that reflected in the journalism of the night. And I'm excited that, WHYY has been so groundbreaking in creating a cohort like this, right? Because when people don't go to the legacy organizations, or, we seem in this country to have some mistrust with institutions, they are going to these other sources. So the more that we can all sort of work together and do a better job of reporting, I think the better, We've said this a few times, but we're all in these little bubbles, right? Working with WHYY has helped me understand how to approach stories in a more journalistic way, right? I probably wouldn't consider myself a journalist, even though I think I said that at the top of this, but words are funny. But I'm a blogger, but working with WHYY the last year, I have figured out how to approach stories in a way that could benefit communities better and be more journalistic. So I think, the more we all work together, the more that we can tell the stories of the city better. And the more I hope people feel reflected in the media.
I love that, Conrad, this through line, right? That our interdependence, right, is the thing that allows us not only to address the moment of today and the future, but also we ourselves in that interdependent relationship can level up. Eric, I want to bring you back into this as the person who has to be able to also zoom in and zoom out around a lot of the issues that in this last question, both Purple and Conrad laid out. I was hoping, you could share a little bit more about, the approach to this restorative church-like experience that you are co-creating with all of these amazing partners.
Oh, you make me want to say amen when you line it up like
say
that.
It.
No, so it just the approach is really starts with acknowledging, recognizing, and getting the partners to recognize their own greatness, their own brilliance, right? I've often told the partners that WHYY, Chris, Sandy, myself, we would have not reached out to connect to you if you weren't already doing something worthwhile and brilliant. And I try to get the partners to understand and keep that central, because it acts as a North Star a lot of times for them to just, when we get involved with organizations like legacy institutions, right? Or someplace that, when we ask Philadelphians about WHYY, everybody knows about WHYY. They may not know all the nuance and details, but they know of it because of its legacy. And so when very small, hyper-local individuals who are creating content in their own little bubble or silo just for their community, right, get invited to participate in something like this, it can be a little bit intimidating. And we've seen examples of it where people start to pitch an idea and they want to kind of change their voice or change their tone or how they present. And we say, no, that's not what brought you all together. That's not what makes you valuable to fit inside someone else's box. And so we want to, again, back to this idea of lived experience and authenticity. I love the fact that we're sitting here talking to a Black woman with purple hair, purple all over the place, and who lives it authentically, like is embedded in everything she does, because it just brings this flavor to life, right? And so we just want to continue to highlight that and make sure that at the same time, similar to what Conrad just alluded to, was that we also help them develop a skill set that allows them as entrepreneurs, as content creators, and as individuals to grow and to flourish. And if they stay connected long beyond what WHYY intends to do, then even better, right? Because we know that these are individuals who deserve to have a broader platform. These are individuals who bring value to the community, and to the point where, you know, the city of Philadelphia has recognized these individuals and this collaborative. That's right. Something of substance because of what it represents for the city, not just their individual communities. Yes. So we just want to continue to uplift them and continue to support them and each of their individual goals as we move forward.
I love how you are breaking this down too, Eric, because again, it's not about the collective over the individual or the individual over the collective, right? It's not this binary way of working together, right? It's the understanding of the interdependence, which is a key point of being a mutual aid collective, which you all have always said from the beginning is the heart of what you do, right? That allows you all to continue to grow in all these amazing ways and be recognized by many people, not just local government, but as others have shared nationally and even internationally, folks are tweeting and celebrating and learning more about you all. It might be because you made that comment about a North Star, but I love this celestial metaphor that's growing. I believe that you all act as not just constellations, but you all have a galaxy way of working together, right? And that's a very powerful, as we again invoke Octavia Butler as we talk about the future. Sandy, I want to bring you in as helping us connect all points in time in this, right? The past, the present, and the future. When, Eric had mentioned this notion of sound, right? And what sounds like news or sounds like radio and information. I know you and I have had some conversations about that. I would love if you could share with us what you think is the evolution of the sound, right, of doing this type of work, and what we should be hearing or expect to hear and encouraged to hear, especially since we're moving out of this binary way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love that idea of the galaxy. I'm in the galaxy at the moment. I think sound is who we are, right? Sound is how we live every single day. And part of the problem with, sort of the format sometimes we have and the voices that have been considered acceptable to be heard is that, erased from that sound has been the voice, the daily voice of people. We're trained to talk in a certain kind of way, and our audience expects us to, be monotone and all these kinds of things. And one of the beauties of working with NICE partners is also, creating new sound, and
Yes.
new sound for the station, but ordinary sound for regular people, right? And so that is really the North Star, is to do more of that, to not make it be something that lives outside of us, but something that lives within us, and within our daily practices. It seems so simple, but it's the thing that every news organization is like, okay, we're going to try to get closer to the people. Well, I mean, it's not that hard, right? But it is about, turning inside out what we thought of ourselves, what the expectation, frankly, where we've trained our audiences to hear a certain way, when in fact, part of that has been erasing some of the daily sound that creates this vibrancy and that creates all of this cacophony. And so that's what we have to continue to get to, is the sound. And as Eric pointed out, creating something that is about the authenticity of the voices of the partners who are there. We're not expecting someone to retrofit themselves to WHYY.
There you go. Thank you for saying that. I think folks need to reflect on that point among many things that have been shared today. Chris, I'm just feeling through the space that is Zoom, a Chrisism. I would love to hear some of your reflections as, again, one who speaks to the power and possibility of committing acts of journalism, and your reflections on NICE so far.
It doesn't feel like a year. It feels like a much longer time. And I think, time flies when you're committing acts of journalism. So there's a Chrisism right there.
All right.
I really, Eric and I talk often, just about NICE, where we want it to go, what's working, what's not working. But I think, we always get back to this sense of it. It's just, to me, it's like magic, because the very beginnings of this conversation of NICE with Sandy and I was literally, it was, hey, can we just find out who these people are? It wasn't about mutual aid. It wasn't necessarily about creating programming. It was like, we just need to create a directory and identify where these people are in the market, so that we know that these people exist. And I think when you look at the very first draft of NICE, and it was hackathon, and it was a lot of different things, and we were just trying to figure out where it was going to go, and a lot of it happened organically. But I think I was so excited at the very beginning to reach out to people like Conrad, who I was a big fan of, and still am to the day. And Purple, who I saw at City Hall all the time, and it's like, who is this person? You know what I mean? And I think she would say the same about me, because she'd always say, you looked at me so mean. And I was like, well, sometimes you were in my shot. I was trying to get a shot, and you didn't get your shot. But, for me, it's just being able to get to know so many new people, to be able to get to see how, collaboration and new things can come into fruition. Things that we don't even think about or plan are happening, right? And that happens because when you put people of like mind into a space, I call it a cognitive surplus, right? Everybody is great individually, but when you come together as a cognitive surplus and everybody puts their brain power and their talents together, you can't help but create magic. You can't help but create something that's much bigger than yourself, right? And NICE is much bigger than WHYY, right? NICE is about the network. And I keep going back to the promise of the network, because I've been a part of a lot of different collaboratives, in my life. And the point of them is to bring you into community, and then you take the lead on how you connect with each other, and you take the lead on maintaining those relationships and making sure that this relationship, this bond, extends beyond any grant cycle, beyond any person's employment, beyond anybody's initiative or agenda. And that's why we don't typically use NICE in the context of project or initiative. It just is. It exists because they exist.
There you go. I love this. This notion also of being is really important. Again, I feel folks are taking notes, right, and doing their diagrams, but the being, the essence of who one is, and recognizing that power and promise in others is just as important, if not more, than the actual doing. And speaking of that, I just wanted to share something from the late great Representative John Lewis. As we as a collective are reflecting on what is going on with voting rights, as well as the fact that I know from our conversations with all of you all, he is a hero and North Star, to build on what Eric said. And so Representative John Lewis once said this: "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is a struggle of a lifetime. Never ever be afraid to make some noise, to get in good trouble, necessary trouble." So, nice folks, please break it down for me once again. How is NICE living up to John Lewis's legacy? What does good trouble and necessary trouble look like for you all as a collective? Anyone can start.
I'll go because
all right, Eric.
It just reminds me, something that Chris was just saying reminds me of something I have frequently told the partners, and it's getting me in good trouble. And that is when I first found out about what NICE was, I was immediately excited. First of all, I can't thank Sandy and Chris enough for hiring me into this position. Someone without a background in journalism and understanding the importance of the community engagement background. But this has been a blessing to me, really. I just can't thank you enough, Sandy and Chris. But I want to say, I've told the partners this frequently, and Purple and Conrad can attest that in our meetings, I've often said that it doesn't matter what happens with this position. This is a grant-funded program, initiative, right? We don't know how long it's going to be. But my goal from the very beginning, when they brought me in and I met these individuals, was for the network to continue regardless of what happened with with WHYY, my role, the funding, whatever. I wanted to make sure that they found fellowship with one another, came into community, and actually continued that legacy. So for me, good trouble is understanding that, as Sandy said, WHYY is just one part of this network, right? Mm-hmm. And understanding that it's a piece, but they all bring something to this that's more valuable than any one individual could bring, right? The fact that we come together, I use an analogy that a friend of mine shared about H2O, right? When you have hydrogen by itself, it's doing its own thing, and you have water by itself and it's doing its own thing. When you put them together, they do something that neither one could do on their own. That's actually brings life and is just miraculous.
There you go.
I can't tell you again. So the good trouble for me is that this is building bridges beyond any boundaries that we recognize early on. So that's the good trouble for me.
I love that. We need those bridges for the life, right, that you're speaking of. Purple, I want to hear from you. Good trouble, necessary trouble.
Necessary trouble, baby. Let me let you know that NICE is the good trouble. The whole collaborative is the good trouble. I can't, Sandy and Chris will attest, they've had several calls to WHYY. Did you know Purple said this? Or did you see Purple did this? Listen, because that is what we're here to do. We are uplifting the voices, and we are shining a light where many people in terrestrial or legacy television can't do, right? So when I'm interviewing Larry Krasner, while I'm interviewing him about, hey, what are you doing about crime going up? What are you doing about gun violence? What are you doing about it? Where in legacy media, they're only going to get a 2-second soundbite of what he's doing. I'm getting the whole 5 minutes of you holding you accountable for what you said, and then making it clear to my people what it's about. So where people in the street right now are blaming Larry Krasner a lot of times for releasing people out of jail, they get arrested and they're right back on the streets. We were able to communicate that, wait a minute, there's another component there. There is a bail magistrate that actually is responsible for this action that we had no idea about. The people in the streets don't know what a bail magistrate is, more often than not. But we were able to make that good trouble and make sure that, that we are aware, knowledge is power. What the truth is, And then it's interesting because a lot of politicians don't even remember, oh yeah, this is truth that people don't know about. They're talking, they're in their jobs, they don't really realize what truth needs to be out in the community. So we are definitely good trouble. We're going to continue to be good trouble as long as they give us the platform to do so and be so. And I want to also take the moment to say, when I first got that message in my Facebook inbox that, inviting me to N.I.C.E, I was like, what is this? Is this real? This is some spam that made it into my my primary mailbox, But then when I actually investigated and seen that, oh wait, this is, I call him a guerrilla journalist. Chris Norris, he's like a guerrilla journalist. I know him. He's always, like I said, like Chris said, looking at me mean, like he was very serious about what he was doing all the time. And then, and that was just an honor for someone like him to reach out to me. And then for Sandy Clark, like I've seen her in many different rooms, and rooms of power, and she's always the Sandy Clark. And and the fact that they were interested in working with me, just is humbling, and then I've been able to, come together and make my craft better, hold people more accountable than I've ever have in the past, to really get and not be scared. Now, talking about fearless. I'm talking about empowerment.
There you go.
Talking about good trouble.
All right. I heard that. Conrad, how is good trouble, necessary trouble manifesting for you in all of this?
Yeah, I think one thing that's crossing my mind hearing with that question is this idea that because we're not just reporting, right? We don't report on an issue and then move on to the next issue. All of the cohorts a part of N.I.C.E are living and breathing this work, right? So not only are we reporting on these topics, these issues, but we are creating events and doing things that are much more than just written word or articles for a website. Not that's very important, but it's also about organizing. So one thing I was thinking of is for the last 10 years I've been working on voter engagement projects, from building murals around the city, working with local artists to talk about why they vote, either in spite of their apathy or because they're excited about a candidate, or somewhere in between, which is for a lot of folks. Working with artists to build poster campaigns to push, for example, this current administration to do more good for more people, including creating healthcare as a universal right. Working towards universal housing. I mean, these are issues that probably it seems like we might not be able to tackle with this administration, but I also believe deeply that the more we talk about them, to Representative Lewis's point, this is not a one-day fight, a one-year fight, a four-year fight, a one presidential fight. We have to keep talking about this because I think the arc of the universe, right, as MLK says, is long, but it leans towards justice, and we have to move towards, in my opinion, a society that makes sure that people don't fall off from food, hunger, housing, or education.
Yes.
And I believe deeply that we'll get there, even though there will be certainly bumps in the road. So my answer to that question is, I think the N.I.C.E partners are all folks who are deeply committed to telling the stories of the community, but we also work with the community to build things outside of traditional journalism.
Yeah, Chris, you spoke earlier about also this notion that's encapsulated in this quote from Representative John Lewis, that we have to think about time differently when we are doing good trouble, necessary trouble. So I want to invite you into this about how you're interpreting good trouble, necessary trouble in this sphere of N.I.C.E and what's going on with the purpose of the summit.
Thank you for that. I mean, first of all, I just love that we are ringing the name of John Lewis in this moment for a number of reasons, and so, dear brother, for me, N.I.C.E is making good trouble because it is addressing systemic inequalities in the way that the news ecosystem works, right? It may not be a direct response to a racial reckoning. It may not be directly responding to racial inequalities, but it is directly responding to who gets acknowledged as providing relevant and timely information to their communities, and who gets to benefit from training and professional development opportunities, and who gets to have their thought leadership encouraged and amplified, right? And who gets to have resources in a mutual aid context. And so, again, when we talk about the fact that you take 12 individuals who relatively are working in isolation, who aren't connected to the institutions that can amplify their work in meaningful ways and aren't connected to each other in a way in which they can transfer human capital and expand their knowledge That's what we're doing, right? And as a result of this work, we are, as Sandy said, we're tearing down the barriers of how you have to sound to get into a certain place, how you have to look to get into a certain place, what type of education or expertise you have to have, right? Is it rooted in academic attainment or lived experience? There's been so many barriers put up in media in general, but public media in particular, and N.I.C.E is just coming in and bulldozing those doors and saying, you can have purple hair, you can get on and start your thing with yep to the yep, you know what time it is. I mean, you can be yourself, right? And you don't have to change anything. And to me, that is addressing systemic inequalities, and as a result, it's making good trouble.
Yes. Addressing these systemic inequalities is recognizing the joy and beauty and inherent value of all folks. And so I love your bringing that through line, Chris, because I think many people miss that as one of the key ways in which we are going to get through this, and not only get through this, but get to a place of justice for real. So Sandy, you know, I think all of us can humbly say thank you so much for your incredible leadership over the years. You know, I opened this you know, conversations with you all, invoking the words of Octavia Butler. We are closing this by remembering also the power and influence needed from the magic that is Representative John Lewis. I brought those two individuals together because I feel that N.I.C.E represents this, but also you are the person, right, who represents the values and the imaginative nature of both of these folks. And so maybe to help close us out, good trouble, necessary trouble. What does that mean, Sandy? What do we need to do in this sacred age that we live in?
Yeah, well, I think we need to run toward it to begin with. You know, good trouble to me is it can be loud and it can be very quiet. And somehow we've made it through this entire conversation without talking about trust moving, you know, trust. How do you say it, Chris?
Moving at the speed of trust.
Moving at the speed of trust, moving at the speed of trust. See, I don't quote Chris quite as smoothly as Eric Marsh does, but you know, this is that, right? You know, one of the encouraging things looking at N.I.C.E, one, you know, we want to thank Eric Marsh. I mean, Eric, we intentionally wanted to hire a community organizer, the very first community organizer at WHYY. Good Trouble was not asking for permission to do that. Good Trouble was not having to explain it too much, but just kind of putting it there. And Good Trouble was picking the exact right person who understood our communities, who understood what it looked like to, you know, really attend to the relationships that we have. And you can see the product of that with Conrad and with Purple, right? And with us. I mean, Eric also comes to us and says, hey, you know, here's what we need to be talking, here's what we need to be talking about. We wanted someone who was not in the journalism orbit to do this. We wanted somebody who understood what it was like in the grassroots space. And we just got not someone who understands it, but someone who does it so extraordinarily well. So, you know, I want to make sure we give a big old nod to Eric. I've learned so much myself from that, and I appreciate that relationship. And Eric operates so much on the quiet Good Trouble space until he doesn't want to, and then he moves into the loud Good Trouble space. So I think we always have to have those forces going all the time. The things that are seen and creates that edge and that rawness sometimes, and the stuff that's not seen, behind the scenes. So that's what Good Trouble is to me, right? And I think that you see it here. How when we talk about trust, look at the trust that develops so quickly with the N.I.C.E partners, right? You know, and when we're talking about building trust with the communities that often have not seen us, the difference of getting to know each other, the difference of sitting across from each other, the difference of how do we mutually support each other, it just has such tremendous benefit. It's not a secret sauce. It's just something that needs to be practiced and nurtured and fed all the time.
Yeah. I want to just thank everyone so much. We could obviously go on and discuss this and build up that good and necessary trouble. Purple, Conrad, it has been a joy and honor and privilege getting to know you over this year and being engaged in this conversation with you. Eric and Chris, the way in which you all seamlessly, although I know it's work, right, build the infrastructure so folks can be themselves, rooted, right, in the support that they need. And Sandy, I also want to thank you. Your last point about it's not a secret sauce is so important for folks to hear. We often act as if literally we need an act of God or some kind of mad scientist to come and bring us the solution, when in fact, if we just listen to ourselves and listen to each other with this openness, right, we really can do those things, as Adrienne Marie Brown has said, around moving at the speed of trust. We really can actually practice a transformative justice and emergent strategy approach, but it has to always come back to that recognition of the magic that is already within all of us and grows when we are together, bursting that bubble, as Conrad reminded us at the beginning. Thank you all. I'm going to turn this back over to our real MC, Chris, to actually close us out. But I encourage everyone tuning in now and in the future, reach out to these folks. Become a part of the spirit and the movement that is NICE.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. As Purple would say, nice, baby. That's how we do. I want to thank everybody who joined us to participate in giving their thought leadership and their expertise for today. Emma Restrepo and Elizabeth Estrada, Alan Jinich and Max Strickberger, Josh Duncan and Mara Zepeda, Steve Fillmore and Carolyn Sullivan, Jim MacMillan, Sabrina Iglesias, Pastor Carl Day, A. Benjamin Manns, Senior Director Erica Atwood, Kenny Cooper, Vanessa Maria Graber, Derek Kane, Madison Karras, POC, Conrad Benner, Saj Purple Blackwell, Eric Mars, Madam VP Sandra Clark, and Roxanne Stafford. All of you contributed to what was promised and delivered as an imaginative, thoughtful, and constructive conversation around journalism, community, and collaboration. I hope you enjoyed watching the 2022 Neighbors and Newsroom Summit. I'm Christopher Flood, the Norris, WHYY's Managing Editor for Community and Engagement. Have a good day.